Chapter 14. Now that we had the songs and the beginnings of a look and feel, we needed a band. We weren't Simon and Garfunkel, we weren't the Everly Brothers, we weren't Jan and Dean. Our songs were built to rock. We made finding a lead guitar player our initial priority. I had never aspired to play lead. To be honest, I wasn't sure I was capable of it. When I listened to people sing, I knew I could do something reasonably comparable. But I rarely heard a guitar solo and thought, I can do something like that. Unless somebody was playing slowly, once in a while I heard a solo by Paul Kossoff of Free and thought I might be able to pull it off, but I just wasn't a fast, flashy player. My gut also told me that this was an area where work might not pay off for me, that I might get only mediocre results regardless of how much time I put into it. Fortunately, Gene knew the perfect guy for the job. Unfortunately, the perfect guy for the job lived upstate, and Gene didn't know exactly where, or even exactly who he was. He had run across somebody when he lived up there, and this person, whoever it was, became our first target. So that fall of 1972, we started hitchhiking up to the Catskills in search of the mythical lead guitar player who apparently played in the bars and ballrooms of the low-rent resort circuit up there. We stood on the side of the major Deegan Expressway with our thumbs out, me in lime green high-heeled boots and him in an antique woman's fur coat. Inevitably, we hit the road without a place to stay. One night, we met some people from a commune outside one of the towns, and they invited us to stay at their place. It turned out to be a barn, and we slept in the chicken coop. The people we'd met collected the eggs. That was their role in the commune. They offered us warm food, but the place was such a wreck that I was reluctant to eat. Later, in the middle of the night, I woke up famished. I went into the kitchen to see if anything was left in the oven. When I opened it, a mouse scampered out. Another time, 2 girls in a VW van pulled over and took us up to spend the night at their place at the top of a mountain. It must have taken us 10 minutes just to get up the winding driveway. Their house was either not yet finished or derelict, and they offered us some spots on the subflooring alongside their dogs. As we were lying on the floor half asleep, one of the girls walked through the room stark naked. Gene opened his eyes and I watched them follow her. I already knew that Gene tried to screw everybody and anybody. It was part of how he defined himself, possessed by and obsessed with pussy. If you make a move on her and she's insulted, I whispered pleadingly, they're going to throw us out of here in the middle of nowhere. We'll end up freezing to death at the top of this fucking mountain. He held back, but the next morning he wound up trying it on with her, successfully. It turned out she wore a hearing aid, he told me, and whenever he leaned in close to her, he heard feedback. Another weekend, we ended up in a town that had already rolled up and gone to bed. We stood on a desolate street until finally a car came towards us. We put out our thumbs and the car pulled over. Inside were 4 tough-looking black guys. Where are you going? The driver asked. Oh, us? We're not going anywhere. The driver got mad. You had your thumbs out. Where are you going? We told him we were trying to get to Grossinger's, a big Borscht Belt resort. Gene knew somebody there we could crash with. Get in. It sounded more like a command than a welcome. The next thing I knew, we were winding down an unlit dirt road and I was starting to get scared. Then I saw another car pulled off to the side of the road up ahead. Great, they're waiting for us. 2 Jews served up on a stick. We pulled up, and another group of tough-looking guys got out of the car. My life flashed before my eyes, but it turned out they just wanted to hang out and drink. When we got back in the car, we said, you know, you don't have to take us. With a combination of anger and threatening annoyance, the driver hissed, I said I'd take you. And he did, all the way to Grossinger's. We never tracked down that guitar player, but those trips were an affirmation of our commitment. Who else but Gene would have taken those trips, thumbing rides the way we were dressed, having no place to stay, sleeping on floors, barely having any money in our pockets? Most people would have just put an ad in the newspaper, which is what we did next, or rather we looked at the ads. Only instead of looking for a lead guitar player, we decided to seek out a drummer. Eventually, we found an interesting ad in Rolling Stone and rang the number. We had one line of questioning. Would you do anything to make it? Yeah, said the guy on the other end of the line. Would you wear a dress? Yeah. We arranged to meet the guy in front of Electric Lady down on 8th Street. He was dressed very cool, cooler than us. He looked quite a bit older than I was, and he had about 5 names. George, Peter, John, Criscola, blah, 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 but he went by Peter Chris. We walked to a pizza joint and sat down with our slices. We hadn't been talking for 5 minutes when Peter blurted out, "I have a 9-inch dick." I didn't know what to say. Pass the cheese? This guy was very different from us. Peter could barely read or spell, and he wasn't a thinker. Still, we agreed to go see him play a gig he had coming up in a bar in Brooklyn. The place was called the King's Lounge, and the other 2 guys in his band looked like they should be making pizzas or cement shoes. Peter looked completely different from them, and he exuded an air of confidence. He had swagger. The crowd was sparse, but something about his performance struck me. He played the bar like it was a packed arena. He was into it. After that, we asked him to come to our rehearsal space the next day to try playing together. When he played with us the first time at 23rd Street, it didn't sound particularly good. Peter didn't know much about British music. He knew the Beatles, and he liked Charlie Watts of the Stones. But that was probably because he liked to believe he played like Charlie Watts, basic, not showy. As for any other drummers, the ones he couldn't play like, he disliked them all. Peter also didn't understand the basics of song structure, verse, chorus, bridge. It all meant nothing to him. If I said, "Let's pick up at the 2nd verse," he just sat there. He had to memorize a song from beginning to end, and if we stopped in the middle or he lost his place, he was fucked. Perhaps as a result, his playing was wild. You could call it unorthodox, but that wouldn't be accurate. It was just plain erratic. His drum parts would change verse to verse. Still, for all he lacked in continuity, he played with fire and vitality. He was scrappy. We asked him back for another rehearsal. The next rehearsal went much better. Again, his playing showed personality and a real zest for life. Some of the songs developed a different feel than Gina and I originally might have had in mind. Peter just couldn't play like the drummers we had in our heads as we wrote, but what he delivered still worked as a blueprint for the band we wanted to be. Looking back now, there's no denying that a drummer like John Bonham wouldn't have fit what we were doing, although if we had our druthers, Gina and I would certainly have gone in that direction. Back then, Peter was the right guy for the band. His drumming was brash and full of piss and vinegar. Peter instinctively played ahead. At times we had to catch up to him. In the best-case scenario, a drummer is like the back of a chair. You can lean back on it and know it's there for you. It's a foundation. But Peter ran alongside us, which was a different animal altogether. Even so, things just clicked. Even as a trio, we sounded very promising. So promising, in fact, that we decided to once again play for Epic Records to see whether or not they wanted to keep us under our existing contract. By this point, Gina and I had scraped together the money to buy new gear. I'd bought 2 guitars, a Tobacco Sunburst Gibson Firebird, and a guitar I had custom-made by a guy named Charlie LeBeau. I got to know Charlie when he worked at a little second-floor shop on 48th Street. It was the first shop I'd ever seen that specialized in vintage guitars. Dan Armstrong stocked Sunburst Les Pauls from the 1950s, beautiful instruments that were always out of my reach financially. But Charlie, who specialized in repairing the instruments, had struck out on his own and started building guitars. I bought a walnut-colored double cutaway from him. The Gibson Firebird started off as a standard. I liked it because it reminded me of one Eric Clapton had played in Cream. I sent it to work with my dad one day and asked him to have the guys at the furniture shop paint it black. It didn't end up with the finish you might normally get on a piano or guitar, but it was black. We had also bought a PV sound system with 2 big speakers on telescoping stands and a mixing board with huge Frankenstein dials. We needed it for the vocals. In our rehearsal space, in any small clubs we figured we might soon play, we didn't need to mic our guitar amps. They were loud enough on their own. Don Ellis, who was head of Epic at the time, and some other execs came down to 10 East 23rd to see the band in late November 1972. We referred to ourselves as the new version of Wicked Lester. Of course, we knew this was a completely new entity, but we didn't have a name yet. We played our new repertoire, which was basically the songs that made up Kiss's debut album. During Firehouse, I took a fire bucket full of confetti and threw it over Ellis, who cringed thinking the bucket was full of water. In the end, Epic wanted nothing to do with the band. They passed and waived any legal obligations that still might have been lingering from the Wicked Lester contract. I had never envisioned the band as a power trio anyway. I never wanted to try to sustain the band on my guitar alone. Jimi Hendrix could do it. Pete Townsend could do it. Jimmy Page could do it. I could not. And besides, I wanted to swing my arm and pose and leave the acrobatic playing to somebody else. So it was back to the drawing board, or rather back to the newspaper. We really needed a lead guitar player. Chapter 15. Guitar player wanted with flash and balls. That was the ad we placed in the Village Voice. And when we opened the door to our rehearsal space on the appointed day in December 1972, we had a lot of takers, more than 30. But becoming a rock star meant looking like a rock star, so we had some specific rules: no bald heads, no beards, and no excess weight. One guy came in a Nehru jacket and beads around his neck. He couldn't speak a word of English. His wife accompanied him as an interpreter. He's from Italy, she explained. Another guy named Bob Kulick was a really good player, but he didn't fit the look we had in mind. After a long and mostly fruitless freak show, a guy walked in wearing one red sneaker and one orange sneaker. He was about my age and kind of goofy and pigeon-toed. While we were still talking to Bob, this other guy plugged in his guitar and started playing. "Hey man, shut up and wait your turn," we told him. Eventually, we plugged in with him, and almost from the minute we started playing, something happened that took us to a completely different place. The combination of the four of us was so much bigger than anything we'd done with the other guitar players. We weren't the greatest musicians, but the chemical reaction of the four of us was potent. 1 minute we had been one thing, and a minute later, with this guy named Ace Frehley, we became something else, something undeniable. I was absolutely stunned. This is it. This is lethal. This is the goods. Ace had swagger, that's for sure. His playing reminded me of guys I really liked: Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck. He was also a total oddball. He moved in a rubbery way and barely spoke. He shrugged his shoulders a lot. We all knew very quickly that this was it. Around Christmas, after our second rehearsal with Ace, we called the guy who had managed Wicked Lester, Lou Lynette, to gauge his interest. He was a nice guy, but pretty clueless about rock and roll. He managed a band called J.F. Murphy and Salt that played at the Fillmore East sometimes, as well as an old folkie named Oscar Brand. Lou was more of a beatnik than a rocker, but he agreed to come to the rehearsal space to see the group we had dubbed Kiss. Thankfully, all the band members had voted in agreement with the name when I came up with it. I had been prepared to fight for it because I was so sure the next key to moving forward was coming up with a band name that was classic and timeless. I saw the name as having multiple meanings. There was the kiss of death in addition to kisses of passion. It was easily recognizable. And it was so familiar that I thought people might say, "Kiss? Oh yeah, I've heard of them." When Lou showed up and we launched into our set, he immediately got upset. "If you don't turn down the volume, I'm going to walk out of this room," he shouted angrily. When we told him about our desire to wear makeup, he whined in exasperation, "Why can't you dress like the Raspberries?" The Raspberries wore matching white suits. Clearly, Lou didn't understand our aim. Oh well, we could book gigs ourselves, and besides, we still had plenty to work on. We wanted to be a power band with roots in British rock and roll, but we wanted to take it 10 steps further. We still didn't know just how that would manifest itself. I had sketch pads full of other ideas. I'd been trying to envision the band I would want to see as a fan, and in addition to stacks and stacks of amps, that vision included distinct characters like the Four Beatles and signature looks cribbed from movies like Zorro and the Lone Ranger and from superhero comic books. For now, though, we stuck with the trend of the New York Dolls and all the other local bands and looked glam and feminine with platform boots and rouge, lipstick, and heavy eyeshadow. Once we had solidified the foursome, we rehearsed 7 days a week. While other bands made names for themselves by playing the Mercer Arts Center or hanging out at Max's Kansas City, we ensconced ourselves in our loft on 23rd Street rehearsing. All those bands were far cooler than we were as people, far more socially adept, and they looked the part more than we did, but nobody worked harder than we did. Sometimes when I was driving the taxi, I would even leave my car at the taxi stand on 23rd Street and 5th Avenue and go up to the loft to practice. Working with Ace came very organically. We didn't have to coach him the way we had to coach Peter. Ace just fit. And after practicing with him for about a month, we were ready to make our live debut. We booked ourselves 3 consecutive nights at a place on Queens Boulevard that had just changed its name from Popcorn to Coventry. A lot of the hip New York City bands soon ended up playing out at Coventry too, including the Dolls, the Brats, the Dictators, Television, and Sniper, which was Joey Ramone's first band. The first of the 3 gigs was on January 30th, 1973. On the morning of the show, I took the subway to Long Island City, the industrial part of Queens right along the East River. There, I rented a van at Public Service Rentals. It was the cheapest place to get trucks. Then I drove into 23rd Street, where later in the day we loaded our gear from the rehearsal space. Ace turned up late and refused to carry anything, not one thing. When we arrived at the club and parked out back, Ace did the same thing. He sat in the back of the van and didn't carry anything. Then as we were unloading it, Ace pulled out his penis totally out of the blue and said, "This is my dick without a hard-on." Huh? I didn't know what was up with Ace and Peter and their dick-size obsessions. Though as time went on, I began to suspect that this was the way they defined themselves and what was important to them. Fewer than 10 people showed up for our first gig. The place probably held 500. We still tried to blow the roof off the place. We knew we'd always remember the show, and it felt great. I'll want to remember this. We played the next 2 nights at Coventry, and each night the crowd was sparse. After each show, we drove back to 23rd Street to stow the gear. Ace sat on his ass and boozed. We were still getting used to his personality. The shows confirmed that he was everything we were looking for musically. But they also confirmed the fact that he was one of the laziest people, the laziest person I had ever met. These first shows made some things clear to me. I had always wanted a big sound, a 2-guitar steamroller, like Humble Pie. And we had achieved elements of that, but at the same time we lacked a sense of heft, of magnitude. I almost felt as if the other guys had jeopardized the band. They acted small time. Ace had babbled into the mic during one of the shows. Peter had said, "I want to thank my friends from Canarsie for coming out tonight." That did not sound big league. It detracted from the image I wanted to project. Perception was reality. I realized there were 3 guys on that stage in Queens who were clueless about how to relate to an audience. You want to be small time? Give a shout out to Tony and Guido. You want to be huge? Make the right impression no matter how many people are there. Interact with the audience as if you're all at Madison Square Garden. From that point on, I was adamant that I would be the one leading the charge on stage. I would be the spokesman. Everybody chattering away was just too chaotic. And even though I had never done it, I knew I could. I knew it. I already had the blueprint. The reason I loved Humble Pie was Steve Marriott, the lead singer, who always seemed to be leading a church revival. He never spoke. When he communicated with the audience, he testified and sang, bringing everything to a fever pitch. Say hallelujah. That was exactly what I was going to do. Say hallelujah, people. I wanted Kiss to be church. That's right. Rock and roll church. Can I get an amen? Funny thought for a Jew. Funny thought, too, for a guy who was in many ways still painfully shy, but I was absolutely confident I could create somebody on stage who would be riveting and engage the audience. That's probably why I had an odd accent early on, vaguely British, vaguely Southern preacher. It was a way to pass myself off as something a bit more exotic than a kid from Queens. The onstage character camouflaged the ill-suited kid with an ear deformity from a dysfunctional family. I would be flamboyant and cocksure. I would project the image that I was coveted and desirable. I would be the guy everyone wanted to know. All the people I perceived as having not been nice to me, as having rejected me as a friend, they would be sorry. But in truth, I would be the Wizard of Oz, the awkward little man behind the curtain operating this huge persona. Chapter 16. The New York Dolls were the template for most bands coming out of the city at the time. Of course I'd heard of them, but up until then I hadn't seen them live. One night in March 1973, Gene and I went to see them at a ballroom in a sleazy midtown hotel called the Diplomat, the kind of hotel where hookers and junkies crashed. They were the kings of the New York City rock scene and arrived fashionably late. actually intolerably late. They looked spectacular, and when they took the stage, the camaraderie and chemistry were amazing. Their playing, however, was not. Still, they looked terrific. Their waists were as big as my wrists. Jean and I looked like linebackers by comparison. We looked at each other. We realized Kiss looked more like a bunch of firemen in drag or something. This wasn't going to work. We couldn't beat the dolls at their own game. Forget being a better dolls. We had to be a better Kiss. We had to win on our own terms. After that show, we decided to ditch all our colorful clothing and remake ourselves in a sinister, all-black look. I used to window shop at a couple of boutiques where they stocked all the latest rock and roll fashions, particularly the stuff that was hot in London. One day, I saw a pair of pants in Jumpin' Jack Flash that would be perfect for our new look, but they cost $35. That was a lot of money. I decided I could buy fabric and make something similar myself. I had never used a sewing machine before, but I took apart my favorite pair of bell-bottom jeans and made a pattern. My mom kept saying I wouldn't be able to put in the zipper. I can do anything. It's simply a question of working at it. The pants in sleek metallic black satin came out great and cost next to nothing, and the zipper worked fine. Gene liked them so much that he asked me to make a pair for him too, which I did. Ace's mom made him a shirt with an applique of an eagle on it. Then we went to a pet store and bought dog collars for ourselves. I needed a Great Dane collar. The poodle collar didn't fit. Eventually, we worked our way to shops that sold S&M gear. I'll never forget climbing the stairs to a place in the meatpacking district and walking in absolutely wide-eyed. I had no idea what I was looking at. Leather hoods with zippered eyes and a tube in the mouth? What on earth did you do with that? We ended up finding some of our early studded cuffs and collars at another S&M place, the Eagle's Nest, down in the West Village. Somehow, wearing white face paint went hand in hand with our new outfits. Together in our loft on 23rd Street, we all sat around looking at a mirror on the back of the door. We had no idea how to apply makeup. It was as if we were possessed, just smearing makeup on, wiping it off, trying different things. First I tried out red makeup, then I tried a ring around my eye like Petey the dog in The Little Rascals. But stars had always fascinated me, and now, of course, I also intended to be the front man of the band, the focal point on stage. No longer would I be the awkward kid, the outcast. I would be the star child. I painted a star around my right eye. It was hard work trying to draw a two-dimensional symbol on a three-dimensional object, my face. It looked one way from the front and another from the side. I was tired by the time I finally created one good star. I didn't want to struggle through painting another one on the left side. Done. It was eye-opening to watch the other guys come up with concepts that suited their personalities. Ace's design was ethereal, spacey, and in the short time I had known him then, that was exactly how I would have described him. The spaceman. He often joked about coming from a planet called Jendel. He constantly threw out off-the-wall sayings like, "One by one I kills 'em," and spoke in made-up languages and gibberish. Sometimes he would shiver and ask, "What was that? Did we just have an earthquake?" And we'd say, "That was you. You just had a tremor." Peter's makeup was elementary. The symbolism was direct, not abstract. He felt that over the course of his life, he'd gotten lucky during a few close calls and thus had 9 lives. You know, like a cat. The Catman suited him. Peter was not what you'd call an intellectual. Gene's makeup was arguably the strongest of all. It was symmetrical and demonic. It was lascivious. It had the drama of kabuki. It was a striking image, and then when he stuck out his tongue, it just made sense, the demon. And as we would soon realize, his look and mine, me smiling, him scowling, created a great juxtaposition on stage, light and shadow. The only measure of whether the images worked was the extent to which each guy felt comfortable in his. The images all enhanced or reinforced characteristics in each of us, and in that way, they weren't just costumes. They were outward shows of things inside of us. It made sense, and we all in some way enabled each other to find those personas. We never sat down and articulated the why behind the makeup. We had no real understanding of why. We just wanted to go further than others had, to become a band the likes of which we ourselves had never seen. The makeup allowed us to embody all the qualities of the English bands I idolized. It presented a cohesive look, a united feel, and at the same time offered the possibility of distinct personalities. From this point on, we began to create a world that we ultimately inhabited and ruled. But at the start, we certainly weren't at the center of anything. We weren't part of the clique of New York bands. We weren't junkies. We didn't hang out at the Chelsea Hotel trying to relive somebody else's past. Some of us could carry on at least semi-intelligent conversations, and that wasn't cool. We were the outcasts of the outcasts. The New York Dolls and other cool bands hung out in clubs surrounded by beautiful girls. We had no time for clubs or girls. We were still too busy trying to become the band we wanted to be. The proof would be in the pudding, and we would eat it like kings. We booked 2 more shows, this time out in Amityville, Long Island, at a bar called The Daisy. It was basically a storefront and couldn't have held even 100 people. They sold watered-down drinks for 35 cents. I rented a vehicle at Public Service Rentals again, this time a decommissioned milk truck. We loaded in our gear, and by we, I mean Gene, Peter, and me, as Ace, as usual, refused to help and drove about 20 miles outside of the city. The staff bristled from the word go. I think we looked too weird and effeminate out there in the suburbs. The guy scheduled to be the bouncer that night said he was going to kick my ass. We ended up locking ourselves in the manager's office, hiding and doing our makeup. Periodically, someone pounded on the door and screamed, "I'm going to fucking kill you!" The upside of having to wait in the office was that we could answer the house phone. Several people called and asked, "Who's playing there tonight?" "This great band called Kiss. You've got to see them." When we finally emerged and took the stage, there were about 35 people in the house. Ace looked at his makeup and the reflective surface of Peter's bass drum and started cracking up. Still, we didn't encounter the antagonism from the crowd that we might have expected, given the bouncer's reaction to us even in our street clothes. A few people chuckled, but more than anything, people were just curious. And pretty much as soon as we hit the stage, they realized 2 things. First, we were serious. Second, this was great. We might have lacked technical ability, but we played with an undeniable focus and ferocity. My makeup was a mask that provided distance between me and the crowd. It gave me the shield I needed. Whatever fears I had of being ridiculed, whether for my normal appearance or for wearing makeup, disappeared. The makeup was armor. It protected me. It was also freeing. Some people were born with it all. I certainly hadn't been, but now I had it. And I was on a mission. Out came the persona I had in mind. Out came Jimmy Swaggart and Billy Graham. Out came the rock and roll evangelist. I sang the praises of mighty rock and roll and all the things I aspired to when I saw the bands I loved. This is my calling. I knew I still had a lot of work to do. Fronting a band is a craft, but I managed to engage the crowd. I was able to communicate with the audience and elicit a response. I preached rock and roll. Are you high? Everybody having a good time? More people showed up the next night and we killed it again. After the second night, we got paid. Once the truck rental and our other expenses were taken care of, we each walked away with $13. It was the first time I'd ever ended up on the plus side after a show. I had actually earned money playing rock and roll. What a feeling, and everyone seemed to share that feeling. With these shows under our belts, we felt confident in our songs. Sure, we still had tinkering to do on our look and stagecraft, but musically, we had gelled extremely quickly and our set already sounded the way we wanted it to. The next step, we figured, was to make a demo to shop to labels. Ron Johnson from Electric Lady had stayed in touch with me and Gene. We had even provided some background vocals for projects he had recorded there. Since we hadn't been paid for those sessions, we approached him with a deal. Instead of paying us, we suggested, get Eddie Kramer to do a demo with us at Electric Lady. Eddie Kramer was a legendary audio engineer and producer who had worked with the Kinks, the Small Faces, Jimi Hendrix, and Led Zeppelin. We'd seen him at the studio and he was a striking character. He sometimes walked around Electric Lady in a cape carrying a cane. He elicited both fear and awe. Ron set it up. Well, sort of. Eddie oversaw the sessions, but his assistant, Dave Whitman, did the actual recording. We cut demos of Black Diamond, Strutter, Deuce, and Watchin' You. The other track we cut, Cold Gin, was a song Ace brought to the table and Gene and I tweaked. Gene and I knew we would be depended on to bring in the songs for Kiss because Peter and Ace never showed much ambition in that department. I didn't begrudge them their limitations, but when Ace showed up with the framework of a song, I was thrilled. After all, we wanted to be like the Beatles, 4 identifiable characters. People liked the Beatles, but they also had their favorite Beatle. George Harrison had a song or two on Beatles albums, and even Ringo got to sing a novelty song now and then. It made the band, any band, more interesting. Toward that end, we had Peter sing my song Black Diamond. We wanted Ace to sing Cold Gin, too, but he refused. We figured the more fully realized the individual members of the band were, the stronger the group would be. Adding more ingredients would only make the soup better. I wanted Kiss to be a club where every member was represented. I wanted it to be multidimensional with 4 formidable personalities. The fact that one of the other guys in our band actually contributed to that illusion by bringing in a song idea was a bonus. Now with a demo in hand, we knew we couldn't be stopped. If you stood in front of us, we were going to crush you. Chapter 17. I think in some ways all bands are dysfunctional. Often part of the reason people get involved in rock and roll in the first place is because they themselves are dysfunctional. If you get lucky, you find camaraderie and some sort of chemistry. The fact that you each feel different brings you together. And certainly it's nice to be part of a club of misfits. Life is easier with a support system. From the very beginning, I felt part of something with Kiss. We were all oddballs, quirky, idiosyncratic, neurotic, but we had each other now. I can't speak for anybody else because I don't know what made them tick or what the appeal was for them at the onset, but for me, Kiss gave me a feeling of finally belonging, an us against the world kind of mentality, and I was part of that sense of us. It was empowering. In Kiss, I had a gang. I wasn't as lonely as I'd always been. But despite our shared sense of purpose, I think the 4 of us all saw the others as odd. We were all odd. And not necessarily in a way that made us gel. In Kiss, we had a collective reason for being, but outside of that, we didn't have a lot in common. So we didn't socialize together outside of the band. Ace and Peter had a lot of friends, and Peter was already married. Gene had a girlfriend. I was still pretty isolated outside of the band. Even within the band, I never let my guard down. I remained remote around my bandmates. I maintained a wall that made it difficult to get to know me at all and impossible to get to know me well. When the other guys joked around with each other, I chimed in. When they made fun of me, however, I didn't take it well. I never betrayed why I was sensitive. I sure as hell wasn't going to expose myself to potential ridicule by telling them about how shattering my experiences as a child had been as a result of my ear-end deafness. I wasn't going to bring up painful things with people who might use those things against me. You can dish it out, but you can't take it, the guys would say, and it was true. It was an instinctive reaction on my part. They didn't understand how I had spent my childhood being scrutinized and ridiculed. How could they? I didn't tell them. Still, it took a lot of effort to cover something like that all the time, and it certainly affected my behavior. But I wasn't comfortable enough with myself to handle it any other way. Peter, it quickly became apparent, was also a very troubled person. He seemed to get off on causing problems within the band. One night after rehearsal, we all went down to the Chinese restaurant where Gene and I used to eat back when Wicked Lester practiced in Chinatown. Peter started making fun of the waiter in a really derogatory way. We found his behavior embarrassing and told him that if he didn't stop, we would leave the restaurant. Peter said, "If you leave the restaurant, I'm quitting the band." He kept it up. We got up and left. And sure enough, he quit the band for a few days. This type of needless drama became part of the way he operated. Ace didn't do things to sabotage the band at that point. Though lazy, he was smart and funny. He constantly told jokes. He liked to drink, but it didn't affect our work, at least in the beginning. Only later would he start to forget the punchlines to his own jokes and have to ask us how they ended. In the early days, when we practiced or played live, he stayed focused and bore down. Once Peter was back in the fold, we booked 2 more gigs at the Daisy in April. Quite a few more people showed up than the month before. I was still learning to control an audience. I felt like a lion tamer. The only way to avoid being destroyed was to put yourself in charge. "It's really great to be back," I said, pretending we'd been out on the road. "We haven't been here because we've been so busy playing." Yeah, in our egg carton-lined rehearsal space. We continued to set up on stage the same way we had from the very start at Coventry, and even in our rehearsal space. 2 vocal microphones, with one on either side of the drum kit. I may have seen myself as the front man, but my mic was never center stage. We were a combination of elements, and so like the Beatles, we never wanted anyone in the middle. Either person could be the singer depending on the song. The odd thing was that because I stood stage left, which is the right side from the audience's perspective, my deaf side faced the rest of the band, but it never occurred to me to set up on the other side. Before and after the shows, Ace continued to say, "I don't want to carry shit." That took colossal balls, but I realized that was who he was and that together we had something special. I had to weigh things in terms of what was important. I had to prioritize. Was it more important to get some guy off his ass to carry amplifiers, carry shit or leave, than to keep moving forward with the band? No. When I carried the gear, I wasn't doing it to be kind or to help him out. I was doing the right thing for me. I wasn't being charitable to his lazy ass. I knew in the end it would benefit me. It reminded me of my initial reaction to Gene. I put up with crap from him because I stood to gain more by accepting some of his behavior than I would lose by telling him to take a hike. In May, we played our first show in New York City proper on the 8th floor of a factory building on Bleecker Street. The loft served as the rehearsal space for a new band called the Brats, whose founder, Rick Rivets, had originally been in the New York Dolls. We had seen their debut show a few months before when they opened for the Dolls. We agreed to play at their loft for free and provide our PA to the other bands, the Brats and Wayne County, a transvestite and eventually transsexual who fronted a band called Queen Elizabeth. When we loaded our gear in that afternoon, the members of the Brats were not too friendly. They wanted to look like the Yardbirds and pulled it off pretty well. They all wore shag haircuts and the best rock and roll clothing, tailored velvet jackets, satin bell-bottom pants, platform boots, all the latest things from England that I recognized from the windows of Jumpin' Jack Flash and Granny Takes a Trip. And they had rock star names. In addition to Rick Rivets, there was Keith Ambrose, Sparky Donovan, and David Leeds. We plugged in to do a sound check and ran through Deuce. The atmosphere changed. The Brats suddenly became our buddies. Once again, we had found that our music broke down indifference and even hostility. We opened the show that night and then stuck around to hear Wayne County, dressed in drag, looking like a spoof of Phyllis Diller and backed by twin brothers no bigger than Oompa Loompas. Wayne's anthem was, "It takes a man like me to be a woman like me," and the high point of the show came when she ate dog food out of a toilet. Not the prettiest sight. All the cool people came to that party, though I don't think they could make heads or tails of us. I talked to Sylvain of the Dolls there. They had just signed a 2-record deal with Mercury and were in the process of recording. "Hey," I cajoled him, "why don't we do a show together?" "You guys would kill us," he said. By the time we went to pack up after the Brat set, my guitar, the walnut-colored one that Charlie the Beau had made for me, had been stolen. I had to start using a black Les Paul reissue while LeBeau made me a new guitar, an asymmetrical Flying V based on one Albert King used to play. I came to be closely associated with that Flying V until many years down the road I began to design my own line of signature guitars. We played the same Bleecker Street loft a month later, followed by another batch of shows at the Daisy. By that point, people literally broke the windows trying to get into the Daisy. It was total bedlam. But we began to encounter a catch-22 when we tried to capitalize on what to us seemed like increasing buzz. Every time we called a booking agent to help us get more gigs, we got the same response. We couldn't get a booking agent unless we had a record label. But whenever we sent demos to labels to try to get a label deal, they wanted to know who our booking agent was. So we figured we'd just have to continue booking our own shows and hope for the best. But outside of the Daisy, we seemed to run up against a wall on that front too. "Who's your manager?" club owners asked when we rang them. "We don't have a manager." "Well, we need to talk to a manager." "Unless we play at your club, we can't get a manager." "Sorry." Something had to give. Then we had an idea. What about the Hotel Diplomat where the Dolls had played? It wasn't a club, so we wouldn't need to persuade a booker or manager to hire us. We just needed to rent the place out. It could be our way to bypass the roadblocks we kept running up against. Everything would be in our own hands. I went to the hotel to inquire about renting the ballroom. It was $500. That was a lot of money, but we decided to bite the bullet. We knew we couldn't fill the place on our own, so we asked the Brats to headline the show. We agreed to pay them a few $100. We even wrote out a contract like concert promoters. We were up to our necks now. In order to draw a crowd and have any chance of recouping our outlay, we realized we had to advertise. We needed handbills we could post around town, and we needed to take out an ad in some of the local papers like the Village Voice. This would all take money too, but Gina and I were still working, and I had gotten Ace a job driving for the same taxi company I drove for. We also wanted a band logo to make the ads and posters look good. Ace had jotted down a logo for the flyer for our Bleecker Street loft shows. He was a pretty decent artist. I took his sketch and used it as the basis for a series of Kiss logos I designed, ultimately arriving at the one that has adorned all things Kiss for the past 40 years. I vividly remember sitting on my parents' sofa while they were out of town and drawing up the final version on thick white stock using a straight edge and a drafting pen. The SS in the logo actually consists of one S that is thicker than the other with different proportions, and they aren't exactly parallel because I just eyeballed it. Ace's concept was closer to the Nazi SS. I certainly suspected that was his inspiration, and the fact that a few years later he bought Nazi memorabilia on our first European tour confirmed this in my mind. As a Jew, I was sensitive about the SS, and Jean's family had survived the Holocaust. My father never liked our logo because he thought my version was still too close to the Nazi lightning bolts, but for me, it didn't hit home until years later when I learned our logo was banned in Germany because Nazi imagery was illegal there. When I drafted the logo, I certainly never intended to court controversy at the expense of victims of history. I didn't want that on my conscience. Once we'd taken care of the ads, we put posters up all over the city. We did it ourselves, at night. We'd take 2 posters, wrap them around something like a signpost, and staple both sides together. I also made logo t-shirts, cutting stencils of the logo from cardboard, laying them on black t-shirts, and then painting rubber cement on the fabric and pouring glitter onto it. Take off the stencil, and there was a sparkling metallic Kiss logo on black. Peter's sister made some too, and we passed them out to friends of the band for the show. We also made up rough and ready media kits and sent them out to people whose names we found in magazines and the credits of record sleeves, managers and producers and booking agents. You could find all sorts of information if you scoured publications like Billboard. Each kit had a folder with a bio featuring the logo, an 8x10 photo, and complimentary passes to the Diplomat. Nobody was hustling like that back then. The show passes listed the set time for our show, not the Brat show, even though they were more the draw. We hoped that the industry types would show up, see a packed ballroom, and assume we had brought the crowd. We had some additional ideas about our stage show, too. In June, I saw Alice Cooper's $1 Billion Babies tour, and the theatricality made a huge impression on me. He really opened my eyes to the possibilities of a rock and roll show. Although it was more staged than anything I wanted to do, it seemed quite choreographed and the whole thing had a scripted feel to it. I liked the atmosphere and environment he created. I wanted Kiss to do things as visually arresting as that, but I wanted the band to be the show by itself as opposed to something that was providing a soundtrack for a separate drama. I wanted Kiss to command the same kind of attention without the use of dancers or giant toothbrushes. The question was how. It would be a while before we fleshed out anything along those lines, but one thing we did immediately was buy a truckload of empty speaker cabinets. They cost next to nothing and looked like Marshall amps. We figured we could stack the empty speaker cabinets on stage to give our setup the right image. We just had to warn the spotlight operator not to hit them with the light because then people would be able to see that they were empty. Early on the day of the show, July 13th, 1973, I rented a van and we loaded in and inconspicuously set up all our gear before anyone else arrived. This was a ruse to make people think we had a road crew. When people eventually showed up, we wanted them to see everything ready for us to walk on the stage, as if somebody had taken care of it all before we even arrived at the venue. Nobody would realize we had humped it all ourselves. In actuality, we had just one guy, a friend of Ace's named Eddie Solon, who handled the sound on our PA. After we set everything up at the hotel, we went back to our loft on 23rd Street and got ready for the show, doing our makeup and putting on our outfits. Peter was up to his usual shenanigans, threatening to quit the band just as we thought we were on the verge of taking a step forward. In order to make him feel better, Gina and I arranged a special treat. When we all went downstairs to go to the hotel, a limo was waiting at the curb. It made all of us, not just Peter, feel special to show up in that car. I can't imagine a limo had ever pulled up in front of that place. The ballroom was nearly full. We realized immediately that we must have covered our expenses. There were probably 400 people there, and at $3 a ticket, we would be in the black. We stomped through the audience in full regalia and took the stage. At least one A&R exec showed up for the show as we had hoped. His name was Rich Chatoyan, and he worked for Windfall Records, which was the home of the band Mountain, who'd had a massive hit with Mississippi Queen a few years before. "Listen," he said, "you guys are great, but honestly, I don't know what to do with you." It didn't seem like a big mystery to me. If you thought we were good live, just put out a record. I didn't think people needed to think about packaging us or marketing us. Just put it out. Of course, it wasn't the last time somebody was taken aback by our makeup. But by this time, we had confidence, conviction even, in what we were doing. And since we hadn't lost money on the show, we also knew we could do this again and get more people to check us out. Maybe somebody would figure us out. "This is who we are," we told the guy. "We are Kiss." Chapter 18. We decided to stage another rock and roll ball at the Hotel Diplomat on Friday, August 10th, 1973. This time we took a leap of faith and headlined it ourselves. We felt we'd done our apprenticeship and were ready to make a bombastic entrance onto the next level. Yet in many ways, Kiss was still an unknown commodity. One day I ran into a girl I'd known at school and showed her the poster for our upcoming Diplomat show. "We'll have 300 or 400 people there," I told her. "What? No way." She wasn't joking. She really didn't believe me. In the grand scheme of things, Kiss still didn't really exist. We knew we had a small following, but filling the Daisy or even the Diplomat, what did it mean? Then again, did the Dolls have a much bigger following? They had a record deal, but they were still basically a local act. Did anyone know the Dolls in Portland, Oregon? No. And for that matter, did the people I grew up with in Queens know the Dolls? Doubtful. Just to be safe, we still pulled in a couple of the cool bands to open, Street Punk and Luger, who, like the Brats, had shared bills with the Dolls. Again, we took out ads in the paper, put up posters all over town, and sent out media kits to anyone in the industry we could identify and track down. And again, mercifully, the same result, a full house. But again, we failed to land a deal for a booker, a manager, or a record label. There was, however, one person waiting to talk to us after the show. His name was Bill O'Coin. He mentioned that he had worked on something called Flipside, which didn't ring a bell for me. I assumed it was a teen magazine like Tiger Beat or 16. Bill didn't come from a management background, obviously, but here he was talking about how he wanted to manage us. He seemed to get us. Not only that, he seemed really into us. He'd heard us, he'd seen us, and he seemed to believe in us. We agreed to meet him. A few days later, Gene and I went to his office at 75 East 55th Street, just off Madison Avenue. He shared space with an ad agency called Howard Marks Advertising. It seemed like a friendly place all around. "Listen," he said right off the bat, "unless you want to be the biggest band in the world, I'm not interested in managing you." That was quite a statement from a guy who had never managed a band. But as Bill talked, he struck me as the missing piece of the puzzle. I had the same feeling I'd had when Ace plugged in. Bill was a kindred spirit. It turned out that Flipside was a TV show that took viewers into the studio with bands as they recorded. Bill had also been the director of photography for a Barbra Streisand TV special. Somehow it seemed logical that an unconventional band would hook up with a manager who wasn't a manager. What Bill did have was contacts that could take us to the next level. We weren't going to find that in a rock club, even if we landed a booking agent. Maybe it wasn't surprising, given his background in TV, that Bill had a lot of ideas about theatricality, too. One thing he suggested was that we never be seen without our makeup. I would never have thought of that. We would exist only as Kiss. He thought beyond what any of us was thinking at that point. He saw a much bigger picture. He was definitely tuned into what we were doing and what we could yet do. And his belief in Kiss was striking. Maybe he wasn't jaded because he'd never been a manager. Bill made one other claim. If you decide to sign with me and I can't get you a record contract within 2 weeks, I'll void the contract. You'll be free. 2 weeks? Wow. At that point, the only sniff we'd had from a label was the guy from Windfall. We said we'd think it over. Outside his office, Gene and I agreed that we liked Bill and his ideas, but I asked Gene, "Do you care if our manager's gay?" "Why?" Bill was fastidious and very well manicured. I read him as gay, but since Bill wasn't overtly effeminate, it had gone right over Gene's head, apparently. "Because this guy's gay." "How can you tell?" Gene asked. Well, he was impeccable, too studied for a heterosexual. Everything was right, the tie, the jacket, the haircut, even his shoes. You and I would never bother with all that. Gene shrugged his shoulders. Good. It wasn't an issue for either of us. Next, we called Peter. We met the guy who should be our manager, we told him. We explained that Bill really understood Kiss. He really got it. We talked about all the things Bill had said he could do for us. Peter was skeptical, as he should have been. When I told him that Bill didn't want to work with us unless we wanted to be the biggest band in the world, Peter said, "Bullshit. People say shit like that all the time." "No, this guy is the real deal," I said. "Get this. If he doesn't get us a record deal within 2 weeks, we can leave." That did the trick. After chatting with Ace, who also got on board, we called Bill and said we wanted him to manage us. "Just one last thing," he said. "You guys don't have any contracts with anyone else, right?" We told him that we had signed something with Ron Johnson, but that it was no big deal. Bill needed to see the agreement anyway. We took a copy to him. We were crushed when he told us, "I'm really sorry, guys, but I can't do anything. You can't piss without Ron Johnson's permission. You're signed lock, stock, and barrel. I can't manage you. There's nothing to manage." A few days after that conversation with Bill, Ron called me out of the blue. "There's a minor complication with your contract with me," he said. "It's run out, so we have to get together and re-sign it." Apparently, the production deal Gene and I had signed with Ron while still in Wicked Lester had expired unnoticed. That was fate. I called the other guys and then we called Bill to tell him that we were free. Bill O'Coin became our manager, and soon we came to consider him the 5th member of Kiss. Chapter 19. We can argue about whether beggars can be choosers, but when Bill told us Neil Bogart wanted to sign Kiss to a record deal, I thought it was our shot. Neil had turned Buddha Records into the #1 singles label in the country by cranking out what some in the rock community might have regarded as prefab crap. He basically invented bubblegum music with acts like the Ohio Express, 1910 Fruit Gum Company, and the Lemon Pipers. Yummy, 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 chewy, chewy, chewy. Neil had recently left Buddha to start his own venture, which was originally going to be called Emerald City Records, but eventually became known as Casablanca. He agreed to sign us after he heard our demo, and a couple of producers he knew told him how good they thought the demos were, too. Neil told Bill, "I'm leaving Buddha and want your guys to be my first act." But Neil had never seen us live at that point. When he finally saw the makeup, he asked us to take it off. That was a deal breaker. Soon, though, Neil realized it was our calling card, the visual embodiment of our mentality. He acquiesced and made us the very first act on his new label. Neil and Bill set up a private concert for the press in early September 1973, and for dramatic effect, we signed the contract and makeup at that event. Now, at first blush, I would certainly rather have signed to a label like Atlantic. Neil had made his career flogging singles, and though he said he wanted to launch Casablanca with a credible rock band, which almost by definition meant marketing albums, not singles, I had my doubts. After all, singles sold by getting airplay on Top 40 radio on the AM dial. Rock was played on progressive FM radio stations. But nothing in Kiss World ever went according to plan. In retrospect, that's part of the beauty of it. Throughout the band's career, we've ignored the rules either deliberately or by circumstance. In this case, we didn't seem to have any choice. It wasn't as if other labels were beating down our door. Once fully on board, Neil got excited. He began to chip in with ideas on how to make our show even bigger. It was Neil who suggested the elevating drum riser. His original concept was basically a forklift, 2 prongs beneath the drum riser to lift it. Neil, it was clear, got it. Bill, however, proved the critical visionary, able to take what was still a rough diamond and polish it. Once we had secured our deal with Casablanca, Bill quickly unveiled some of his ideas for the band. The first thing he did was introduce us to his boyfriend, Sean Delaney, who unified our look by dyeing all our hair blue-black. We all had dark hair already, but he wanted us to match. We went to an apartment on 11th Street and 6th Avenue and dunked our heads in a bathtub to give us what Sean wanted to be the jet-black hair of Elvis or Roy Orbison. Bill also rented a new rehearsal space for us, a cramped, rat-infested basement in the Village. And in there, he set up a video camera. Again, this was something that never would have occurred to me. We could see ourselves. Great idea. Even bands like Kiss that prided themselves on being visually arresting rarely had a chance to see what they really looked like. Together with Sean, who was himself a performer, singer, and songwriter, Bill wanted to analyze the way we moved. This was the TV guy thinking, obviously. When I performed, I thought of myself as moving all around, swinging my arms and embodying the rock and roll guitar hero thing. But when we went to the videotape, I could see how small everything was. You could barely make out my gestures. I had to modify my moves if I really wanted to grab the audience. Sean served as coach and cheerleader, helping me to develop dynamic, effective moves. Like everyone else in our haphazardly assembled team, Sean became devoted to fleshing out the Kiss concept and helping us be as good as we could possibly be. Once during rehearsal, he noticed us kind of swaying in unison for a second. He found the spot on the tape and played it back for us. "See this moment when you move together," he said? "That should be part of the show. That should be something you do, a signature move." I think initially we all thought it was kind of corny. We were going to be choreographed? But we decided to give Sean's idea a go, and the 3 of us, Gene, Ace, and me, stood close together at the front of the stage, moving our guitars and swaying. Looking at the videos, we realized that it worked. Sean was right. And sure enough, when we first did it in front of an audience, people went crazy. Sean's move killed. We didn't know we needed a Sean until we had Sean. He really upped the theatricality of our act, and later he co-wrote songs with almost all of us. Another day, Bill had us into his office. He introduced us to a guy named the Amazing Amazo, or something corny like that. "A magician," he said. The guy breathed a ball of fire and scorched the ceiling of Bill's office. "Okay," said Bill. "Who wants to do this on stage?" "Not me." Gene agreed to give it a try, and the rest is history. All of this reinforced my initial thoughts about Bill. His ideas were miles away from those of other people, including the members of the band, or any other band for that matter. Bill understood as much as we did that we didn't have to play by anyone else's rules. He approached things without preconceptions, and he was energetically delivering on everything he had said at our first meeting. Near the end of September, almost 9 months to the day since our first ever gig together at Coventry, and only a few weeks beyond Bill's self-imposed 2-week deadline, we went into Bell Sound to record our debut album. Our debut album! We requested Eddie Kramer as the producer since we were pretty pleased with the demo he had supervised. But Neil had something against him. Eddie had worked on an album by the band Stories for Buddha Records that hadn't spawned any hits and might also have cost more than Neil expected. So Neil paired us with Richie Wise and Kenny Kerner, who had actually gone into the studio with Stories after Eddie and cut their big hit, Brother Louie. Opening that door on 54th Street, walking up the stairs and entering Bell Sound the first day was terrific and terrifying. We set up all our gear and the technicians placed all the microphones. I was afraid that if anything moved, the results would be cataclysmic. I ran around telling the guys, "Don't touch anything. It's exactly where it needs to be." We were totally green. But this could not have been more different from Wicked Lester going into the studio on spec time. This time we had producers who led us and told us what to do. We recorded quickly, all in the same room with virtually no overdubs. We had the songs down and they changed very little from the demos we had cut back in March. We didn't understand anything, we just waited to be told what was next. At first I was self-conscious in the studio. I knew the song so well, but when the tape was rolling I started watching my fingers on the guitar and fouled up. Something that came so naturally became stilted. I saw the microphone as an intimidating obstacle in front of my face instead of seeing it as an ear, just a way to speak to the public, like on stage. I had to stop thinking about the surroundings. I had to recognize that all the studio gadgetry was a vehicle to get to the public, not an obstacle. It took some time, but I settled down. I still had a lot to learn, how to sing into the mic, when to sing away from it. But part of what makes a first album so vibrant and alive is the fact that the musicians are typically just pups. That was certainly true for us. I was only 21 years old. When it came to listening back to our music on studio equipment, the fact that I was deaf on one side had no effect. It was the way I had always heard music, and my inability to hear stereo had no bearing on what I did or thought because it was the way I had always heard things. The one thing I noticed was that when we listened to the mixes, I found myself sitting a few feet to the right of center. I just scooted over to compensate without even thinking about it. That didn't mean I was hearing stereo, but it created a balance. Whenever I was between two speakers, I would move to where the sound was optimal for me. If I looked up, I was always toward the right side. At lunchtime, sandwiches magically appeared. It was incredible. All this and free food, too? We had no idea at that time that all those sorts of perks were tacked onto the recording bill, which went onto the tab we owed the record company. All I could think was, we're in a studio, recording songs we wrote, living the dream and being fed. How much better can it get? We talked Peter through the songs as we recorded them. I had a microphone into which I had to say things like, okay, here comes the dat-dat-dat, or now the rat-a-tat-tat. It was the only thing that worked. I didn't think the drums had the same power I heard on records by a lot of British bands I listened to at the time, but that was mostly because of the way our album was engineered. Old-school engineers didn't believe in pushing the meters into the red. They thought it was wrong. You didn't want distortion. You didn't want to overdrive things. Kenny and Ritchie's engineer definitely fell into that school, and it affected the recordings. I wished we had somebody who was aware of what was being done in the contemporary world of the genre we worked in. But we didn't, so our record came out a bit flat. The guitar sounded plinky and piano-like instead of big. Gene's bass runs, he wasn't a bass player who stuck to pedaling on the root note, got lost. The vocals had more of an ambient quality. The overall sound lacked breadth. Pushing the limits on the recording console gave a lot of our contemporaries a pulsating urgency that our record lacked. It was another case of things not going to plan. Sure, it was a bit rinky-dink sounding, but based on the way the album has since been received, I suppose it might have been a blessing in disguise that the recordings didn't sound as bombastic as I thought we sounded live. And anyway, just making a record far outweighed any critiques I might have had about the sonic qualities of the recordings. Each night we left the studio with a great sense of accomplishment. We said goodnight, see you tomorrow, then we each went to our parents' places, except Peter, who was married and living with his wife. Before long, we had finished all 9 songs. We had our debut album in the can. The art department at Casablanca asked whether they should redraft the logo for the album cover to make each S the same width and ensure they were perfectly parallel. It got us this far, I said. Don't touch it. Next, we needed a band photo for the album cover. In those days, people still misunderstood us, even people hired to work with us. The photographer who shot our first album cover, Joel Brodsky, had done the Strange Days cover for The Doors. When we showed up at his studio, he was very friendly and seemed genuinely excited. "Look what I've got for you," he said. He brought out a carton filled with all sorts of straw hats and red rubber noses. "What the hell?" "You know, for your pictures," Joel said. "No, I don't think you understand," we told him. "We're serious. We're not clowns. This is what we do." He was stunned. "You mean you guys aren't meant to be funny?" No, this is us. He could keep the straw hats and red noses. A lot of people didn't understand that this wasn't fun and games to us. It wasn't frivolous. It was a religion. It was a crusade. Joel told us there was a makeup person on hand for the shoot. We all did our own makeup anyway, except Peter. He had the makeup person do it, who decided to make his face look like some sort of tribal lion mask. We had never seen that makeup before, and we were glad not to see it again. So maybe our record cover didn't look the way I had expected. And maybe the record didn't sound the way I had expected. But by God, we had an album. That trumped everything else. I was so excited. For all the minuses I may have felt about the sound or the cover, we now had a finished album, which was the prerequisite for all the other things we wanted to do. We were in the game now. With everything done, Bill told us we were going to go out and start playing. I had no concept of the country we lived in, let alone the world. The idea that we were going to travel to other cities? I didn't have the slightest idea what these places were like. I just assumed every new city would be like New York. We had our revamped show nearly ready to go. The forklift contraption would lift Peter's drum kit up about 7 feet. We had Gene fire-breathing and the three of us swaying in unison. Just one last piece of the puzzle remained as far as our show was concerned. Pyro. Pyro had not yet become a science. We just auditioned a few maniacs who liked to blow shit up. We needed somebody who could make big booms. Bill eventually found our guy, God knows where. I don't really know if there were any credentials at all for early pyrotechnicians. All they needed was a fascination with fire and explosives. We probably saved lives and property by hiring these guys and keeping some arsonists and pyromaniacs off the street. Chapter 20. On December 31st, 1973, we glimpsed the future. Bill somehow got us added to a New Year's Eve bill at the Academy of Music featuring Blue Oyster Cult and Iggy and the Stooges. We were fourth on the bill under a local New York band called Teenage Lust. Now I knew it was just a matter of time before we started blowing everybody away. And that night, we certainly made an impression. When we walked out on the stage in front of 4,000 people, I was stunned. It might as well have been 400,000. Not long into the set, I popped the button on my homemade pants and struggled to keep them up for the rest of the set, pressing my guitar awkwardly against my crotch to keep them from slipping down. Then Gene lit his hair on fire when he tried the fire breathing that the amazing Amazo had taught him. We were dangerous, all right, to ourselves. Still, even before the end of the night, I realized I didn't need to feel too bad. When it was time for the Stooges to play, the band took the stage and started playing, without Iggy. Crew members had to carry Iggy down a flight of steps, drag him to the side of the stage, prop him up behind the curtains dangling there beside the stage, and then basically throw him out on stage. Iggy could barely stand up, much less walk or jump. I suddenly realized why he did all those crazy contortions. Despite the hype and legend, I thought the Stooges were awful. Even so, we now knew we weren't ready to be headliners. Not yet. Fortunately, we had one more small-scale tune-up show scheduled before we headed off to Canada to kick off our promotional tour. Unfortunately, Neil chose that moment to approach me about something bugging him about my Star Child character. I was wondering if we could tweak your makeup a little, he said. What? Why? Your makeup is, well, it's a little effeminate. Maybe you can ditch the star and try something else? To be a good sport, I agreed to experiment with a mask, something closer to Zorro or the Lone Ranger. After the show, Neil said, "Can you also maybe lumber around on stage? You know, like a caveman or something." Fuck this. Why would I do that? It's not what I'm about. I just didn't understand his objections. I was proud to be the Star Child, and I didn't see how any of what I did had the slightest thing to do with my sexuality or my perceived sexuality. If anything, I thought hints of androgyny demonstrated confidence and comfort with my sexuality. And besides, people were drawn to it, so who cared what they read into it? It was just the way of the world back then. A lot more people were afraid of anything that might be taken for gay. In fact, that would become more clear in the following years. In that regard, Neil was right about how my character might be interpreted. It's just that I didn't care. We didn't play by the rules, and I wasn't going to yield to received wisdom or irrational fear. My idealized vision of a frontman was definitely not a Neanderthal. I went back to the Star after that single show in January 1974. I was still living at home and my parents were raising my niece Erica. I didn't have much money and sure as hell wasn't going to spend what little I did have to rent a place of my own. I knew from this point on I wouldn't be around much, but I loved the increasingly deep bond I shared with Erica and loved serving as a big brother to her now that she was walking and talking. Next thing I knew, my parents were driving me to the airport to catch a flight to Edmonton, Canada. Our album had yet to come out, but a musician I wasn't aware of, Mike Quattro, whose sister Susie was very popular in England, had canceled some dates in Canada, and Bill snagged them for us. Sitting in the back seat of my parents' car on the way to the airport, I felt like I was being driven to summer camp. Little did my parents know they were actually driving me to a residency in a traveling whorehouse. Almost as soon as we landed in Canada, I realized that girls wanted to sleep with me, though the sleeping part was not a priority and was definitely secondary to more strenuous bedroom activity based on only one criterion. I was in a band. I was desirable, and I could hardly believe it. In addition to easy, random, nonstop sex, there were concerts to be played. The venues for those 3 shows were college cafeterias, and we didn't have our full arsenal of tricks along for the ride. Peter's drum riser stayed in New York, though Gene still breathed fire, and the stage, which on these dates was hardly more than some folding tables pushed together, was wreathed in dry ice fog. Mike Quattro obviously had enough of a following to have those shows booked for him. And even though he couldn't have been that big, given the venues, people were confused when we took the stage each night. They had no idea who we were. Hard to blame them, since our album hadn't been released yet. We had a few interviews on that first trip. We had no idea how to do an interview. We had no strategy on how to come across cohesively. The only thing we had discussed with Bill was the fact that we would never be photographed without the makeup. That strategy, while great in concept, turned out to be a bit of a bummer in practice when we were first faced with the possibility of at least the minor fame that could be said to go along with having your picture in a local newspaper. Since we were to exist only on stage and in photos of us in full regalia, the journalists came to the venues and talked to us all together after we were already made up. It became clear that the 4 of us had no idea how to discuss the particulars about things like how the band got together or what we were trying to accomplish. We hadn't conceptualized those things individually, much less as a group. We tried to sound interesting or controversial, but just came off like a bunch of idiots. We'd been thrown into the deep end of the pool and had no idea how to swim. One thing that struck me, though, was that for a guy with a great vocabulary, Gene sure used the word I a lot. Whenever I tried to answer questions about the band, I naturally answered using we. But when Gene answered similar questions, he always cast it as I. That really threw me. The questions were about the band. This wasn't supposed to be about him. It was about all of us, Kiss. Our idea had always been to present ourselves like the Beatles, the 4 guys all living in the same house, skiing down the hill in Help, or whatever. As an only child, Gene apparently didn't feel he had to answer to anybody or explain himself. It pissed me off, but I said nothing. Back in New York, after about a week in Canada, Neil tipped us off that Nothing to Lose, which he had released as a single, was going to be played at 2 p.m. one day on WNEW, the big local FM rock station. My parents and I crowded around their Harman Kardon console and waited. Then Alison Steele said, "There's a new band called Kiss, and here's their first song." Then, Nothing to Lose played in our living room. That moment, hearing my band on the same station that played Led Zeppelin and The Who, was monumental. I'd spent hours listening to my heroes on that station. There had been a sense of unreality about the album until other people heard it. Even when I'd seen the finished cover in Bill's office, it hadn't seemed real. Now it was real. And the following week, when the album would be available in record shops and maybe even displayed in shop windows, and we would play a launch party in Los Angeles, it would be even more real. We flew to Los Angeles in mid-February for the party, which Neil had organized at the Century Plaza Hotel. It was a coming-out party to introduce us to the industry, including Neil's partners at Warner Brothers Records and whatever celebrities Casablanca could rope into coming. I immediately loved L.A. It was a different country, a world apart from the one I knew. Driving down Sunset Boulevard, I saw billboards touting bands instead of cigarettes or beer. Wow! I hoped to see Kiss up there one day. The city embraced music in a way New York didn't. It seemed to revolve around music and movies. It also felt somehow healthier. The combination of the sunny weather and the way people took care of themselves struck me. Casablanca put us up in the Chateau Marmont and rented 2 Chevys for us to drive around town. We would pile into the cars and go to Denny's or McDonald's. I roomed with Ace in a 2-story bungalow off in a private section of the grounds. Jean roomed with Peter. Each bungalow had 2 levels and several bedrooms and bathrooms. The first day, Ace went out for a walk and I decided to take a shower. While I was in there, the bathroom started to smell horrible. I pulled open the curtain to see what it could be, and there was Ace sitting on the toilet taking a dump. He looked up. "What are you doing in here?" I yelled. There were other bathrooms in the place after all. He just shrugged. Ace was odd. Early in our L.A. visit, I asked a few people, "What do you do here? Where do you go at night?" One of the first places mentioned was the Rainbow, a bar and restaurant on Sunset Boulevard in West Hollywood. I had never heard of it, but as soon as I walked in, I knew I had found my synagogue, a new house of worship. The people in there weren't looking for anything more than a promise of tonight. It seemed to be a system of friends with benefits or strangers with benefits for a newcomer like me. The very first night, I met a great-looking blonde whose only criterion for going back to my room at the Chateau Marmont was that I was in a band that had a record deal. Being a musician and looking the part, I was in platform boots and rock star chic as usual, got you pretty far on Sunset Boulevard, which was fine with me. It was all so uncomplicated. In a way, she and I were both celebrating the same thing, the exaltation of rock and roll. I had just gotten Led Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy on cassette, and I put that in a cassette player next to my bed in the hotel room. That album will always be synonymous with my first foray into the Appreciation Society of the Rainbow. When the woman left the next morning, I realized the scene in L.A. had no false expectations, in either direction. There was no judgment, no sense of condescension. We appreciated each other in a kind of wholesome way, as odd as it may sound. That night and the subsequent nights, all of which I spent at the Rainbow, was my rite of passage into rock and roll at a level I didn't know existed. I had heard about a rock and roll lifestyle, but I didn't have a sufficient idea of what it was like to even fantasize about it. My concepts of fame and rock and roll had been hampered by my limited experience. I expected the payoff to come in the form of a hot girlfriend. Instead, it came in the form of being with a different hot girl every day, sometimes several in the space of one day. It was incredible. L.A. seemed like the land of Oz. On February 18, 1974, Casablanca officially unveiled us at a party that was a bit like a cross between a bar mitzvah and a C-list celebrity gathering. Neil got up on stage and introduced us, and we started playing. Before we finished our first song, everybody cleared out of the ballroom. Too loud and too garish, they complained. Hey, we weren't the Eagles. No comfortable volume or songs about being desperate in the desert. We were East Coast, proud of it, and thought the whole West Coast cowboy thing was a bit of a joke. I felt an odd sense of pride at having scared off these people. What did we care if they didn't like us? They weren't our type either. Alice Cooper came to the event that night, too. Afterwards, he joked, "What you guys need is a gimmick." A few nights later, we drove down to the Aquarius Theater, also on Sunset, to make our first ever TV appearance. Dick Clark had expanded beyond American Bandstand and had a show called In Concert that featured 3 different bands playing a few songs live on each episode. The format suited us, just us doing what we did, and it felt like another milestone, a network television show hosted by Dick Clark, no less. Dick came to our dressing room when we arrived to get ready for the performance. I learned over time that a lot of people in similar positions weren't nearly as cordial as he was. Bill Graham, for instance, a highly respected promoter who ran the Fillmore in Winterland, was anything but nice to us when we first met him a few months later. But Dick was special, and when I shook his hand, all I could think was, that's Dick fucking Clark. For all those years he had been an inspiration to me as a kid, he had seemed as fantastical as Superman, but no, Dick Clark really existed. We set up on a revolving stage, and a band called Redbone played before us. Then the stage turned, and the dim lighting suddenly became bright stage lighting. There we were in front of the cameras, but we were a machine by that point, and we played ferociously wherever we were. We felt good about the performance. We didn't see it until 6 weeks later when we hurried back to a motel after a concert in Asbury Park, New Jersey, to watch the broadcast on a crappy TV. After taping in concert, we flew back to New York to cool our boots for a few weeks before setting out on our first real tour in mid-March. I remember lying in bed in my parents' apartment thinking about my time in Los Angeles. Women, restaurants, TV shows, fancy hotels, and all the perks and amenities that went along with success, and I prayed, God, please don't take this away from me now. That small modicum of recognition was so addictive. The fact that the chubby, unpopular kid was being chased by women purely because of how I was perceived differently now. And I was now being paid to do what I loved doing anyway. It had been okay before I knew it existed, but now that I had tasted it, I couldn't bear the thought of having it taken away. I was fine before I tasted the cake. Everything was different now. I prayed, fearful that it would be pulled off the table before I had made the most of it. The crumbs were so exhilarating. I wanted more, and I was terrified it would end too soon. God, don't take this away from me yet. Please, God, not now, not yet. Chapter 21. Now that we had a record, we secured a national booking agency, ATI, to keep us on the road. ATI added us to bills as the opener and got us into clubs on our own. Our first show on March 22, 1974, in Pennsylvania, we opened again for Redbone, the same band we had shared Dick Clark's rotating stage with the month before. Then we did a couple of shows with the British band Argent, and we were on our way. During the course of the year, we opened for ZZ Top, Blue Oyster Cult, Manfred Mann, and many other bands, even the New York Dolls. When you went to a concert in a theater or arena in the early 1970s, you typically saw three bands. First, an unknown act, Kiss in this case, then a somewhat bigger band, often billed as special guests, and then the headliner. The goal was to work your way up the ladder. The three-tiered system gave you a chance to hone your craft, and while we understood the need to hone our craft, we also took our full arsenal of explosives, smoke, and fire with us wherever we played, whether we headlined a tiny club or played to a half-empty ballroom before two other bands. A Kiss show would always be a Kiss show. Breathing fire, waving our guitars in unison, blowing shit up. If we sometimes ended up getting Peter pinned to the ceiling when his drums elevated, or we offended a headliner because our pyro filled the venue with smoke, then so be it. We didn't compromise, and fortunately, Bill Aucoin seemingly had no credit limit on his American Express card because he funded the expenses of transporting and staging our show at a time when what we earned each night didn't come close to covering those costs. We drove a station wagon from town to town, staying in flea-bag motels. Sean Delaney served as tour manager and did the driving. He was like a den mother, making sure nobody got lost on the field trip and managing the personalities. Bill came along for parts of the tour as well, and when he wasn't around, we each talked to him on the phone every day. He had a knack for making each of us feel like his favorite member of the band. And of course we had a road crew to set up and tear down our stage and effects, to maintain our instruments, and it often turned out to fight with the headliners' road crews when they demanded we tone down our act since we were just the opening band. The road crew drove a big truck with all the gear, except for the 4 Samsonite makeup cases complete with mirrors. Those stayed with us in the station wagon. When we played a few dates with the band Argent, their crew kept cutting our set short, pulling the power before we finished. They also fought us tooth and nail on all our effects, It's tough to follow a band that leaves the place filled with smoke to remind everyone throughout the rest of the concert that World War III had just been fought and won by 4 guys in 8-inch heels, black leather, and makeup. Then, on the last night of our tour leg with them, we miraculously had a trouble-free show. Afterwards, we found out why. Our crew had locked the guy in charge of their production in one of the huge road cases we carted our gear in. Our road crew believed in the cause. Another time when we opened for Aerosmith, who were also an up-and-coming band at the time, but somewhat ahead of us, our crew showed up and found their crew had set up in a way that left us only a few feet of depth. We would have to have crab-walked onto the stage. Our crew told the Aerosmith crew, "You have 5 minutes to move your amp line back, or we throw everything into the pit." And one of our guys pulled a knife just to emphasize how serious they were. They quickly made room for us. Of the initial few shows, one at the Bayou in Washington, D.C. on March 25th stands out. Everything was magical at that point. We were barnstorming around the country, getting paid to do what we loved most. I didn't really have any bills to pay back then, but the idea that in theory I could pay them by playing rock and roll was a terrific feeling. This was my occupation. This was how I made my livelihood. The night of the show at the Bayou, I saw my first gangbang. I walked into a motel room where the crew was staying, and there was a young woman on the bed and a line of guys, our roadies and various other people waiting their turn to mount her. I had never seen anything like it. It was as if they were waiting for the bus, and it was not something for me. I did meet a woman that night, though. She was strikingly beautiful. She'd have been far out of my league a few weeks earlier. Somehow, it made me feel a little paranoid. What if she had a boyfriend or husband who would want to kick my ass? Suddenly, there was more to it than just whether she and I wanted to consummate and celebrate all things rock and roll. Other people might be connected to her decisions, people who might not be happy about her indulgences. To make things worse, I eventually connected the dots based on the things she told me and realized that her dad was a mobster. At some stage as we lay in bed naked, I turned to her and said, "Are you here because you want to be here, or are you here because you're drunk?" "I'm here because I'm drunk," she laughed. Sometimes I felt like a bull in a china shop. Other times I heard a voice telling me that sex went hand in hand with fear and consequences. If you get somebody pregnant, you're on your own. In other words, if you fuck the wrong woman, you're dead. No matter the fear, anxiety, or inner conflict, sex was my drug of choice, and I always went back for more. I had a few drinks now and then, but I didn't need booze to screw up the courage to talk to women. I had no trouble making advances or starting a conversation. And anyway, I quickly learned that it didn't take a whole lot of witty banter to interest a woman. I was in a band, and that was enough to make me desirable. Drinking more heavily or doing drugs didn't appeal to me. I never wanted to lose control. I was dealing with newfound freedoms and opportunities, and I wanted to remain lucid and remember it all. But drugs were around from the earliest days of the band. People showed up at the venues, at the motels, and at the radio stations and record shops where we did promo appearances and wanted to befriend us. The guys threw drugs at us, and the women threw their bodies. I had use for only one. The road crew, on the other hand, picked up the various colored pills that fans threw on the stage and gobbled them down like Skittles. It freaked me out. You don't even know what you just ate. One morning I went to our pyro guy's room and there was no answer. I pushed the door open, and he was huddled in the corner with a blanket over his head, looking green and unable to move. I didn't see the fun in that. The fact that nearly everyone in the rock world was high definitely contributed to my socializing less. Drugs were part of the culture, and not doing drugs set me apart. The fact that I wasn't doing blow or taking pills made other people uncomfortable. The fact that they were uncomfortable made me uncomfortable. My interactions with groupies and other women, on the other hand, were purely sexual, and drug use rarely came up. I couldn't imagine a better rush than having a woman want to go back to my room with me. Ace was an alcoholic, but in the beginning he stayed sober until after the show, at which point it was normal for him to drink until he was unable to stand. It was still funny then. For me, the ultimate gauge of whether his drinking was a problem was whether he was doing his job, and he was. What he wanted to do offstage was his business. One night I found him crawling down the hall of a motel on all fours, talking to himself. "What are you doing, man?" I asked him. "I've got my little people with me," he said, gesturing around himself. As I tried to get past him, he said, "Oh, you just stepped on one." In some ways it was pathetic, but in other ways I have to say it was funny. We laughed at Ace a lot, and not in a demeaning way. He was amusing. He was an oddball. He constantly told jokes. Only later did it become ugly. Once he mixed in Valium and cocaine, it wasn't as funny anymore. Initially, though, he was just a likable kook. At one point, Ace got the nickname the Chef. With the exception of Gene, who never took his clothes off or showered in front of anyone else, we often didn't wear a lot in the dressing room before or after a concert. One night while we were sitting in front of our mirrors putting on our makeup, Peter walked up behind Ace and put his dick on his shoulder. Ace very nonchalantly turned to the side and gave it a kiss. So he became the chef, because he had to taste everything. We also called Ace Scraps back then because he often reached across the table and took stuff off our plates. "Are you eating that?" he'd ask, and then grab. We all had breakfast and dinner together on the road. The breakfasts at cheap motels were pretty much the same: scrambled eggs and toast and those little cups of grape jelly you peeled the top off of. Dinner varied. If someone had shrimp, Ace would eat the tails you left on the plate. Sometimes in motels, he would rummage through discarded room service trays as we walked down the hallways. It wasn't unusual to spend 10 or more hours a day in the station wagon together. Ace kept us laughing. One time Peter, who was older than all of us and had a long, mopey face, said, "I have the baby face in the band." Ace said, "Yeah, maybe a baby walrus." Another time in the car, Ace said, "I could really use a drink." This was not unusual for Ace. "You can drink my cologne," I said. "Really?" "Sure," I said. "Cologne is alcohol." So he screwed off the spray cap and took a swig of my Aramis. He spit it right out. We all laughed, including Ace. I thought of us as the Four Musketeers and figured we'd be together forever. We were the Vikings, the Huns, the Mongols, wreaking havoc in every town we invaded. We were the Beatles skiing down the hill in Help. We were Kiss. There was a genuine sense of camaraderie as we ate together, traveled together, got dressed for a show together, and played together. And on stage, we were a unified force. It wasn't real life, of course, and when we occasionally went home for brief stretches, we didn't see each other at all. On the road, though, we were Kiss, and it was fun to be Kiss. I knew we would work through and beyond this phase. There was almost a wistfulness. I was conscious that we were living this quaint rock and roll existence on the way to stardom, because stardom was never a question in my mind. We are going to make it. Bill set up promotional appearances at local papers, radio stations, and record shops at every possible opportunity. After a few months, we began to get a little big for our britches, moaning about having to do appearances. One afternoon, when we were supposed to get dressed and go to a record store, we decided we weren't going to show up. Fuck it. Bill was out with us at the time, and he came storming to our motel rooms, gathered us together, and yelled, "Are you kidding me?" We told him we didn't feel like doing it. We felt like it was a waste of time, and maybe even beneath us. "You guys are acting like you've qualified for the Olympics or something," he scolded. "You're not even contenders yet." We looked at each other and said, "Oh." We put on our makeup. We went to the record store. We listened to Bill, and he was almost always right. Neil, on the other hand, approached things from an entirely different philosophy, learned during his Buddha days, and seemed to find nothing wrong with jeopardizing an act's potential career longevity for the chance of a hit single today, no matter how trite or substandard. He got us into a recording studio in early spring 1974 to do a cover of an old Bobby Rydell song called "Kissin' Time." He told us it was promotional music for a kissing contest, an idea that was contrary to everything I envisioned for the band. I thought it was tacky. The bands I looked up to wouldn't do something like that, but Neil assured us our recording would be used for background music in a radio spot for the contest, nothing more. Of course, no sooner had we cut the not particularly great rendition of the song than Neil issued it as a single. He had a unique way of dealing with things sometimes. After the single was released and the kissing contest was rolled out on some radio stations around the country, Neil scheduled us to appear at one of the contests being held at a record store. I walked in there in full makeup, feeling very full of myself, and strolled over to a couple who had their lips locked. I bent down, we had our platform boots on, and the guy, while keeping his lips in contact with the girls, looked out of the side of his eyes and said, "Who the hell are you?" They were just two kids in a kissing contest. They had no idea it had anything to do with us. "Never mind," I said, and made for the door as quickly as my studded heels would carry me. Chapter 22. We averaged a little better than one concert every 2 days. At the end of April, Bill landed us another national TV appearance, this time on the Mike Douglas Show. I could tell this one would be different. It was a variety show, not a music show. We could have just as easily have been monkeys on unicycles or spinning dishes on sticks. Ed Sullivan's show was like that too. "We've got Topo Gigio and the Dancing Bears, and for the kids, the Beatles." Only on Mike Douglas's show, the audience was just like Mike Douglas, older, to put it mildly. The crowd looked like moms and pops out of a Norman Rockwell painting, and we looked like aliens to them. We were clearly out of our element, and I had a feeling we would be not only treated as a novelty, but milked for laughs. We had to win over audiences when we opened for other bands, and we relished the challenge. This, however, did not look like fun. This wasn't an audience I thought I could win over, and I had no desire to go out and get ridiculed. Bill asked, "Who wants to sit in the chair and do the talking during the panel discussion portion of the show?" I said, "Not me. I'm staying backstage." Gene went out. He didn't know what to say and described himself as evil incarnate and stuck out his tongue. Cody Fields, a comedian who was also a guest that night, dismissed him as a nice Jewish boy despite the demon getup. He came off pretty goofy, but his being the default spokesman of the band would lead to countless more episodes of him using I instead of we, subtly and not so subtly implying that he was the front man, lead singer, and mastermind all wrapped up in one. He never attempted to clarify his role or refute media assumptions. Why would he? Those false assumptions were based on Gene's own statements. Once again, I found myself scratching my head at his refusal to be honest and his insistence on using every opportunity to discuss things from his own perspective rather than the band's collective perspective. He was cheating. Earlier that month, we had opened a show at the Agora in Cleveland for Rory Gallagher. When we walked out onto the stage, a girl in the front started elbowing her boyfriend and laughing. "You won't be laughing for long." We blew the place up. Smoke filled the entire venue. These places were not ventilated well. Back then, our pyro guys had to make their own flash pots. Each day, they built enclosures and filled them with explosives. One night, the flash pots could be like kernels of popcorn being popped, and the next night they might blow a hole in the stage. We didn't have to apply for permits or have a fire marshal inspect what we were doing. Nobody knew what we were doing, and nobody had done it before. We just blew crap up and set off explosions with no oversight or expertise. It was intense. On nights like that, I might as well have turned over an hourglass and waited for the sand to trickle down. It was like clockwork. We always won over even the most skeptical people. We never failed to get a crowd on its feet. Of course, no show, no matter how big, could mask a crappy band. And Kiss started with the four of us bringing it. You can have a beautiful car with a sparkling paint job and loads of chrome trim, but if it doesn't have a great engine, it isn't going anywhere. We provided the engine, and we won audiences because of the power of the four characters and the music we made. Another night, we opened for a mid-level British blues band called Savoy Brown at a jam-packed ice skating rink in Michigan. Some of the guys in the band had never seen us, and they came to the side of the stage as we started playing and laughed in full view of us. I was laughing inside, though, because I knew how tough it was to follow Kiss. And sure enough, they may have been laughing during our set, but they were crying when half the audience left during theirs. They changed their tune after that. Some of the musicians we met I liked as people, and we played with a lot of bands whose music I liked and respected, but our attitude as a band was always the same. We will annihilate you. When I reached the stage steps, it was no longer a kumbaya moment. Even though it wasn't conceived in hatred or animosity, We were deadly serious about the fact that we wanted to kill other bands when we hit that stage. Not the audience, the other band. We took huge pride in what we were doing. We were focused, we were driven, and we wanted to decimate them. We are Kiss. We were missionaries for Kiss's brand of rock and roll, and we would not stop until we converted everyone. Sometimes our missionary fervor took on biblical proportions. One night in Fayetteville, North Carolina, our bomb set the curtain on fire. The curtain owned by the headliners, Black Oak, Arkansas. We got thrown off that tour. In the Deep South, people loved us when we were on stage. We had a license to be freaks on stage and were welcomed as entertainers. But off stage, people wanted to kill us. As soon as we left the venues and were just guys in platform boots with big hair, wearing scarves, jewelry, and women's blouses, we felt hunted. Outside of rock clubs, people had zero tolerance for guys who looked to them like fags, which people constantly shouted at us. I kept worrying we might end up squealing like pigs, like in the scene from the movie Deliverance, which I had seen the year before. I realized I'd grown up pretty insulated in New York City, not understanding the kind of anger that looking different could elicit in other places. Still, I sensed the discrimination more than I saw it. That couldn't be said for some of our crew members, like our road manager, J.R. Smalling, the guy who came up with our stage introduction. You wanted the best, you got the best. J.R. was black, and for several days when we had a local driver in the South, the white driver kept referring to J.R. as Leroy. I also heard the N-word hurled around a lot. We didn't attract hecklers, though. For one thing, I think people who came to shows found us somewhat intimidating. And our willfulness was obvious, too, our commitment to what we were doing. When we ran into people outside the show calling us names, I wanted to say, hang on a minute, I'm the same guy you were clapping for. I put down my guitar, and you want to lynch me? We stuck close to our motels in places where we didn't feel safe. We ate at the motels, got in our car, and hit the road. We weren't big on stopping at Billy Bob's Diner or Bubba's Barbecue. We got our asses from point A to point B. We passed Graceland at some point along the road, and I was very disappointed. It just looked like an anonymous doctor's house in the suburbs. I had expected a massive mansion. I opted to go off with a couple of women who owned a clothing store in Memphis instead of taking the tour of Elvis's place. Even in the South or in other conservative places like Salt Lake City, we found our fans or they found us. And always women. Girls waited in the lobby or out front of our hotel rooms until we were available. We could have had one of those machines you see at the motor vehicles department. Take a number and wait for it to be called. Most of the time, I didn't even know the girls' names. It still amazed me that the women I met on the road came to my room with barely so much as an introduction when I figured there were probably guys in town who had to date them for months to get anywhere. It all quickly became normal, and what a relief. I was now getting laid and felt desired without any fear of emotional connection, which was the last thing I wanted. I got what I craved without any of the dangers as I saw it. Because of my insecurities, my ear, my hearing, and the defenses I had built up over the course of my life, emotional connection continued to frighten me. It meant having to open up and give something of myself, which I didn't want to do. We couldn't afford individual rooms yet. I roomed with Peter, and we both hoped we wouldn't be alone in bed when the other guy had someone there. We never had any privacy. But it was certainly nicer when both beds were filled, rather than one of us having to put a pillow over his head. In those cases, I hoped for a quick few minutes with Peter's guest if he left the room. It made sleeping easier. Eventually, Sean Delaney began to see it as his job to kick girls out of our rooms under the pretense that we needed sleep. Sean wasn't fond of the girls, whom he often called breeders. That first 6 months of touring in 1974 was a bit of a blur. Long drives punctuated by stops in venues with names like Thunder Chicken, Mothers, and Flashes. We played college auditoriums, gymnasiums, and even a high-life stadium in Florida. We made it as far as Alaska, where we played outdoors at a drive-in cinema, and the space heaters at the front of the stage kept throwing the metal strings on our guitars out of tune. Even during that first blurred year, however, we found places that became favorites, like the Electric Ballroom in Atlanta. Somehow we headlined blocks of shows there. We played 4 nights in a row in June. After we drew crowds for several more nights in July, they booked us for 4 additional nights in September. The parties and hospitality on all levels were never ending, and we got excited whenever we saw it on the itinerary. Any girlfriend or wife in New York didn't. Kiss also clearly connected with Detroit from the get-go. People there got us. It was such a fertile area for rock that we loved too. From Mitch Ryder to Bob Seger to Alice Cooper, Ann Arbor had the MC5 and the Stooges, Flint had Grand Funk Railroad. Michigan embraced us, and before the end of 1974, Detroit became the first place we could headline a theater. I would always recall it as the first city to open its arms and its legs to us. Through all of this touring, we didn't have multiple sets of stage clothes, so we could always find the dressing room at a venue by following the stench. As the smell got stronger, I knew I was getting closer. Some days we did 2 sets, an early show and a late show, but even on days with just 1 show, the clothes never dried. Putting on damp, fetid clothing made my skin crawl. Whenever possible, I took a hairdryer to my jumpsuit. At least then it was warm, damp clothing. After my wardrobe malfunction at the Academy of Music with the button popping on my homemade pants, I had bought a pair of danskin tights. I took a lot of flack for them at first, but they turned out to be really practical, and the other guys ultimately made the switch too. Leather and satin got crisp and mossy after they soaked up enough sweat. Damp boots were another problem. Mold or algae grew in them. The inside of each boot looked like its own little ecosystem. The only thing missing was frogs jumping around in there. We often had to scrape green crud off the outside of the boots too. Still, nobody ever complained. In my case, it was because there was nothing that compared to the rush I got when the curtain dropped and the audience went crazy. The curtain might as well have been a 15-foot thick concrete wall, and when that barrier was removed, utter chaos. I could be on one side of the curtain with a 102-degree fever and a sore throat, struggling to sing the first notes of Strutter or Firehouse with some effort. But when the curtain dropped, I sang like a bird because the adrenaline kicked in. It didn't matter how tired or sore or sick I was. When I got up on stage, I felt supernatural. People wanted to surrender to us. Part of what made me feel powerful on stage was taking that license and knowing how far I could push it. That took time to learn. I realized that if I asked people to do things they already wanted to do, I came across as omnipotent. I was in control. People responded to that. People wanted to be told, "Get up," or "Raise your hands." Did putting their hands up have anything to do with a song? Only in the same way that a church congregation raises its hands skyward to try to touch something holy. It was also fun, like riding a roller coaster without holding the bar. It was all about what we could create together. It was all in the back and forth. Most of the people were willing to go. They just needed somebody to guide them. They needed me. I had to connect. I wasn't just playing to the back row of a theater. I was playing to people. I had to make that person in the last row feel as important as the one up in the front. I wasn't playing to a mass, but to each and every one of those people. I am talking to you, right there. That was my job, to take us all to the rock and roll promised land, individually and collectively. Some of you people are sitting down. If you want to sit down, go home and watch television. But if you believe in rock and roll, stand up for what you believe in. Each night we created something magical with the audience, and it was every bit as magical for me as for them. Chapter 23. I learned a lesson early on. Bill Aucoin said at one point in the summer of 1974 that we needed to make another album. "But I don't have any inspiration," I said. "I'll show you the bills and you'll get inspired," he said. That may sound cold, but it rang true. Anybody could sit around and wait for inspiration. Talent was being able to conjure it up, to get inspired. Our first album, Kiss, had leveled out at sales of about 60,000, and we needed new product. We set up camp at the Ramada Inn in L.A. for a month in August to make Hotter Than Hell. We each got our own room this time. We felt like stars. Walking around one morning after breakfast, I noticed Lyle Tuttle's tattoo parlor on Sunset Boulevard. I walked in. I decided I would get one tattoo. I swore to myself that it would be one, just one, for life. I knew I didn't want a skull with a top hat or a battleship or mom, so I settled on a rose on my shoulder. Back at the hotel with my new ink, I called home. I was excited and also wanted to ruffle my parents' feathers, I guess. "Guess what, Mom? I just got a tattoo." "Oh, Stan," my mother said, referring to a Jewish cultural taboo. "Now you can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery." "Cut my arm off, Mom. It's not going to matter to me." Again, I found L.A. inspiring. The city revolved around music and the entertainment industry. I rarely met people who had grown up there. It was a place people went with a sense of purpose. Lots of New Yorkers lived there, having migrated to California and taken over businesses. The locals were so laid back that New Yorkers could devour everything. L.A. was a destination for people with a career plan or an agenda. It was a rootless place where people went to chase dreams and follow their aspirations. Neil rented Village Recorder out by the beach in Santa Monica and flew out Richie and Kenny. The studio was in a cool old building with a huge mural on one side of it depicting a post-apocalyptic cityscape, crumbled buildings, collapsed highway overpasses. We hoped to remedy some of the problems we heard on the first album. The main thing was to make it heavier. We did end up recording it hot this time, meaning with distortion, but that didn't work well either. Once again, we didn't get what we were looking for, and the result was an unpleasant distortion on the instruments. Among the songs we recorded, some were leftovers, like Watching You and Let Me Go Rock and Roll, and some we wrote in the studio and never even demoed. We didn't have an album's worth of material when we started recording. We didn't travel with acoustic guitars, and little practice amps weren't common either, so we hadn't written much on the road that first year. Occasionally I would write down lyrics, but the creative key for me was recording the melody on some kind of device. The title track, Hotter Than Hell, I wrote in L.A. It was an homage of sorts to All Right Now by Free and started with the same basic premise, meeting a woman. Gene brought in Goin' Blind, a song he'd written with Steve Coronel. It sounded cool, and I knew what they were going for. I suggested the line, "I'm 93, you're 16, which sounded very warped and knocked the whole thing a little sideways. "That's weird," Gene said. "That's a really weird line. Do you think we should?" "Yeah, absolutely," I said, and with that one line it became a song about an old man in love with a young girl. Got to Choose was based on a song I'd heard at Electric Lady. The facility had 2 studios, and they were often both in use nearly 24 hours a day. It was a round-the-clock fortress of creativity. One evening they had been running off copies on the 2-track machine of an album by a band called Boomerang. They were a blue-eyed soul unit made up of Mark Stein from Vanilla Fudge along with a couple of other guys. Boomerang had recorded a cover of the Wilson Pickett song 99.5 Won't Do, and that was the seed for Got to Choose. We tried to get Ace to sing Strange Ways or Parasite. Again, he refused to sing on the album. Gene ended up singing Parasite, and Peter did Strange Ways. Comin' Home was a road song Ace and I built around a damn good riff and some fragments of ideas he had. I wrote Mainline in L.A. too, and thought it had a great swagger to it. When we were working on it at Village Recorder, Peter said, "Either I sing that song or I'm quitting the band." I was astonished. Same shit, different day. Right from the beginning, Bill had pushed the idea of pooling the money we made off songs and sharing the revenue so everyone would feel equal. He figured that way nobody would demand to have songs on an album just for the financial reward, and we could determine the song selection based on what worked best in our eyes and the eyes of the producers working with us. We had done that. But with Hotter Than Hell, we saw the first signs that this wouldn't always help stave off potential friction. Maybe everyone in the band was just too different for us to be cohesive. Though I never saw Gene as like-minded, I did see him as a partner. But to me it was clear that Gene continued to see the band as a vehicle for himself as an individual. Gene was in it for Gene. Whatever the reasons, he didn't share the collective mentality I had. I found security in the band. It provided something lacking in my life. I wanted to belong. I needed that sense of family, of camaraderie, of a support group. So for me it was always about the team, and I coveted the band above all else. Ace was increasingly self-destructive in a way that chipped away at his talent. One night he repeatedly drove his rental car down a steep winding road to see how fast he could go and still make the turn at the bottom. The ultimate outcome of the experiment would have been obvious to anyone but an inebriated Ace. And sure enough, he finally lost control of the car and wrapped it around a pole. We weren't yet to the point where we had to desperately try to get a solo out of him before he passed out in the studio, although that would soon come, but he certainly wasn't fully realizing his potential and giving his all. Peter seemed to resent everything he was given. It was a no-win situation. The fact that he was given things further highlighted his inability to contribute. He began to vent his inner turmoil and feelings of insecurity by trying to make everyone else as miserable as he was inside. Peter also resented me for not paying my dues, as he constantly put it. As far as I saw it, Peter hadn't succeeded before hooking up with us because he had no idea what it took to become successful or to sustain success. Now he was along for the ride and couldn't help trying to hamper things and create strife. I didn't begrudge anybody's limitations, but I definitely begrudged Peter's attitude, the animosity and conniving. I couldn't wait to leave the studio each night around 9 p.m. I went straight to the Rainbow. I was a convert from our first visit to L.A. in February. Now in town for a month, I went to Mass every night. We certainly weren't famous, but in there we had rock star status. We had an album out. We were recording another. I really hit it off with a woman named Karen who worked there as a hostess. She was a bit older than I was, and we instantly took a liking to each other. She befriended me. She had traveled on tours with various band members of Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin, the upper rungs of the rock hierarchy. One of the walls in her apartment could have been in a music shop on 48th Street. Rows and rows of signed 8x10 photos of bands. We remained good friends, and it never seemed odd to me that our relationship turned physical only later, after Kiss took off and we became famous. There was a purity to the system at the Rainbow. The women were part of the rhythm of rock and roll. They were essential to it. No possessiveness, no judgment. And each morning, back to Village Recorder. One day I entered the studio and looked around. "Where's my guitar?" I asked. "Wait, where's my amp?" "Oh," one of the studio employees said. "They already came and picked up all the gear." "What? What are you talking about?" "Yeah, they came for it already. They were here. Said they had come to pick it up." Thieves had dispensed with any high-tech scheme and just walked in and said they were a shipping company and made off with all our gear. The easiest way out was through the front door. We got reimbursed and bought new gear, but some of my guitars, like my Flying V, had been custom-made and could never be replaced. Another day I was on my way to the studio in a rental car when a police car pulled up behind me and turned on its lights and siren. I pulled over. I was wearing my usual off-duty uniform of hip-hugger jeans, really low rise, with about a 3-inch zipper, platform boots, ruffled woman's blouse, and jewelry, with my hair tumbling in long curls over my shoulders. In New York, this wasn't a big deal at the time. The officer walked over to the side of my car. "License and registration, please." "It's a rental. I have no idea where the registration is," I said, as I reached for my wallet. My wallet wasn't in my pocket. "I left it, I don't have my wallet," I stammered. "I must have left it at the hotel." In New York, not having my license with me had never been a problem. "Well then," the cop said, "you're going to jail." I nearly pissed my pants. I turned as white as a sheet. "Jail? Look at me. You can't take me to jail looking like this." The cop looked at me. He must have seen my terror. "Be sure to carry your license next time," he said, and motioned for me to drive off. Note to self, always carry wallet. Chapter 24. Kiss had slowly climbed the touring ladder, and for some of the shows toward the end of 1974, we started to be special guests, the second band on a bill rather than the anonymous third. You know, tonight in Cedar Rapids, REO Speedwagon and special guest Kiss, plus surprise third act. Part of becoming successful was getting your own hotel room. Part of becoming successful was traveling by plane instead of by station wagon or rental car. Sometimes when I was home for an off day, still crashing at my parents' place, a limo picked me up to take me to the airport. We had switched to flying commercial flights from gig to gig, getting picked up and driven to and from hotels, while the gear caught up with us by truck and met us at the venue. We had also moved up to Holiday Inns instead of roadside motor lodges. It was easy to think we'd won the lottery as I put another quarter in the vibrating bed each night. At some point, in addition to having our own rooms, we even began to rent a spare room dubbed the Chicken Coop, where we could party and girls could wait their turn instead of loitering in the lobby. After a show, we would retire to our individual hotel rooms to freshen up, and then the phone would ring. The Chicken Coop is room 917, the tour manager would tell us. We'd go down to a room full of girls, all of whom wanted to go back to our rooms. Some of them came from the concert audience. Others were connected to a local radio station, or knew somebody who knew somebody on the crew, or at our label, or whatever. We had also managed to get additional clothes. We hired a guy named Larry Legaspi, who made clothes for the band LaBelle, who had a huge hit at the time with Lady Marmalade, and had a kind of disco in outer space look. We also gave sketches of the new boots we wanted to the uptown New York bootmaker Frank Anania. An old-world craftsman, he couldn't make heads or tails of the designs, but he made us boots that, unlike the street versions we had used up to then, were both more stable and more sturdy. All the better for all the jumping and running around we did on stage. I met my first girlfriend in Atlanta in September when we returned to the Electric Ballroom. Or rather, she became my girlfriend at the end of that run in Atlanta. Amanda was a tall, curvy blonde from Michigan who was traveling with one of our technicians. She flirted with everybody, and finally one night when the technician wasn't feeling well, she slipped him a couple of Valiums and took off with me. I took her back to New York since we had a few days off. I was still living with my parents. She and I slept on the fold-out sofa in the living room, which was where I slept when I was home. I didn't have a room anymore because the one I had shared with my sister now was my niece Erica's room. The sofa bed sat against the wall to my parents' bedroom. One morning when Amanda and I were staying there, my mom came out and just making small talk, I asked her, "How'd you sleep last night?" "Not well," she said. The sofa kept banging against the wall. I knew it was time to get a place of my own. To be honest, I had known that for a while, but I hadn't been totally comfortable with the idea of living on my own. Now, conveniently, I had found somebody to move in with. We grabbed a copy of the Long Island Press and paged through the listings for apartment rentals. We found a furnished apartment on Woodhaven Boulevard in Queens, near the Long Island Expressway, that was cheap and available immediately. We took it. It wasn't the Waldorf Astoria, but it still made my finances very tight. Our first day there, we sat around listening to AWB, the new album by the Average White Band. Then I was off on tour again, gone for weeks at a time. I was always above board when I left and told her not to ask me what happened on tour unless she wanted to hear the truth. She knew that world, but she didn't care. She had worked her way up from a lighting technician to a band member. Touring came with a certain amount of isolation. We had no contact with other bands at our level. With the exception of Rush, we didn't socialize much with other bands. Even if we wanted to, we had 2 hours of makeup and wardrobe to deal with before each show. Since we traveled constantly, the only interactions we had with the few musicians we did know were secondhand. News we gleaned from groupies who had seen them when they passed through town the week before. "Oh, Queen's coming through next week?" I remember saying to a female guest in Kentucky. "And you'll be with Roger? Say hi for me." The demands on the road crew and tour managers were so extreme that they often couldn't hack it for long. Road managers in particular, we shuffled through constantly. We hung out with those guys, but it was such a revolving door that few became real friends. Wives and girlfriends quickly became abstract realities because there were no cell phones and hotel phones were expensive. Nobody even had answering machines or call waiting, so the chances of catching somebody were slim. We lived in a bubble. Still, being back out on the road also meant less conflict within the band. For one thing, we were forced to function as a unit on the road. For another thing, despite whatever issues each of us was dealing with, the availability of women tended to replace the intra-band friction with a much more pleasurable type of friction when we were on tour. And anyway, being on stage playing rock and roll was my dream. Sure, we were making only $60 a week. That's what Bill salaried us, but I was getting paid to rock. This was my job. Every week on the road was another week I wasn't driving a taxi or working for the phone company. Despite all the apparent progress of our career, sales of Hotter Than Hell leveled off quickly, selling only a little better than the first album. The situation was more dire than we realized. One afternoon back in New York for a day or two off, I went into Manhattan to see Bill at his office. I had decided to ask him for a raise. I thought we should get $10 more per week than the $60 we had been earning for about a year now. I walked in and sat down facing Bill, who was sitting with his feet up on his desk. There was a hole in the bottom of his shoe and duct tape stuffed into the hole to keep it somewhat closed. He had a hole in his sweater, too. On second thought, never mind. Little did I know Bill was $250,000 in debt on his credit card from financing our tours, and Casablanca was on the verge of collapse. "What's on your mind, Paul?" he asked. "Oh, nothing. Just came by to chat," I lied. When I saw Bill, it was obvious we were all in the same boat. He was making sacrifices for something he believed in, too. I stuck with my $60 a week. Fortunately, as the band began to climb the ladder, Gibson started giving me free guitars. All I had to do was call the company and ask. Then, whenever I was in New York, I would unpack them from their shipping boxes and get on the subway to 48th Street. I took the brand new Marauders they sent me and unloaded them at music stores to put a little extra money in my pocket or to pay the rent. When Kiss played at the Santa Monica Civic Center as JoJo Gunn's special guest on February 1st, 1975, Neil Bogart, who had relocated Casablanca to L.A., came to see us. He came backstage and told us, "Your album stopped selling. Hotter Than Hell is dead. You have to end the tour and go back to New York and do another album." We had one song finished that I knew was special. Weeks earlier, Neil had said something with a sense of perception that was much clearer than ours. You need a song that your fans can rally behind, that states your cause, something like Sly and the Family Stone's Dance to the Music. You want to get people pumping their fists and joining in. I had taken a guitar back to the Continental Hyatt House that night and went straight to work. Pretty quickly, I came up with the chords and a few lines for a chorus. I want to rock and roll all night and party every day. I knew this was the perfect battle cry. I went down the hall and knocked on Gene's door. "What do you think of this?" I asked, playing what I had. "I have a song called Drive Me Wild, but I only have the verses and no chorus," he said. It went, "You show us everything you got. You drive us wild, we'll drive you crazy." We coupled his verse to my battle cry. As we got to work and finished the song, I could picture people pumping their fists and singing along. This could be the rock and roll national anthem. Chapter 25. We flew back almost immediately to New York to record Dressed to Kill in early February 1975. Neil came too because he had decided to produce the album himself instead of using Richie and Kenny for a third time. Some songs Gene and I wrote in the morning, and Peter and Ace came in the afternoon to record. We had very few leftovers, just She and Love Her All I Can, so we had little choice. We also hadn't written anything on the road. When faced with the choice of noodling on our guitars or nailing a woman from the chicken coop, it was no contest. When I wrote a song like Room Service, it was a musical diary. I was totally immersed in that life now. The coxmanship was no longer just a fantasy the way it had been on our debut album. Life on the road was everything I had conceived of and more. Hot and cold running women. Everybody and anybody, willingly, gladly, take no names. The joy in the vocal on Room Service is real. I was celebrating this life we were living. I was reveling in it. Come On and Love Me came to me quickly in my apartment, very organically, just stream of consciousness. She's a dancer, a romancer. I'm a Capricorn and she's a Cancer. She saw my picture in a music magazine. When she met me, said she'd get me, touched her hips and told me that she'd let me. To be able to write something like that without laboring over it is a place you just can't get back to. It's writing without rules, without any thoughts of justifying or answering to anybody. I think that over time you can become a more technically proficient songwriter, but that doesn't mean you write better songs. This was our third album, yes, but all three within barely a year, so we still had the freedom of not really knowing the rules, of not analyzing the lyrics under a microscope. The lyrics in Come On and Love Me created such a fluid rhythmic effect. Later in life, I couldn't write lyrics like that even if you put a gun to my head. A guy in the studio who had worked with Bachman-Turner Overdrive told me that BTO used acoustic guitars in the mix to help sonically define the guitar sound. We tried that on Room Service and Anything for My Baby. We used acoustic guitar to pad things, to give additional clarity and definition. We were really grasping at straws at that point, anything to try to get something of the sound we wanted. It didn't seem like it should be so difficult to get the sound we heard in our heads and on stage. All we want to do is sound the way we do live. Neil didn't do much. He sat in the room and tried to keep us from doing too many takes. Not because he thought he could capture something special in an early take, just to save money by getting the album done more quickly. I remember doing a sloppy take and Neil saying, "Well, that should do it." "No," I told him, "we need to do that again." We recorded the whole thing in about 10 days, and the entire album clocked in at something like 28 minutes. Most of the songs were well under 3 minutes long. On the original vinyl version, the space between the songs was quite wide to try to make the album seem longer. Casablanca pressed and released the record about 2 weeks after we finished recording it. The company's situation was clearly getting desperate. A few days after the release of Dressed to Kill on March 21st, 1975, we had a homecoming show booked at the Beacon Theater in Manhattan. Fewer than 2 months after we had opened for Jojo Gunn in Santa Monica and were told to come up with another album, Jojo Gunn opened for us at the Beacon. The Beacon represented a step up. A lot of the places we played during our first year of touring were converted movie theaters or vaudeville theaters, places like the Tower Theater in Philadelphia, the Paramount in Portland, and the Orpheum in Boston. My old haunt, the Fillmore East, which had already closed by then, started life as a Yiddish theater too. They were grand theaters with terrific acoustics, but they were about half the size of the Beacon. The Beacon was so big that the New York promoter Ron Delsner agreed to do the show only if he didn't have to put up any money in advance. He didn't think he'd sell enough tickets to cover a guarantee. But when the tickets went on sale, they sold so quickly that the only way to meet the demand was to do 2 shows in one night. We felt like returning heroes when we came back to the city to headline 2 shows. We'd gone off boys and come back men. We were a different band with a lot more experience and a following that a lot of people, including the New York promoter, didn't realize we had. It felt like a victory parade. Except in Queens, when I ran into people I knew out there, they often still had no idea about the band. With the Beacon shows, I thought of us as the biggest New York band, but that didn't make us a household name by any means. We had a cult following, that was all. I was proud that many local celebrities and members of other bands came to the show. We were the big band in town now. They all came to see us now. But the world still beckoned. I knew we had reached only one of the base camps on the way up the mountain. I never thought that was the peak. I planned for us to be superstars. But this was a chance for us to take stock and see how far we'd come. I was so tired after the first show. I went up to the dressing room to retouch my makeup. I figured it would be easier to touch it up and dry my hair and outfit with a hairdryer than start over. We didn't have much time for reflection after the shows as we left the next day for Ohio. As the tour continued, we flipped the script on a lot of the bands we'd worked with the year before. Slade, Uriah Heep, and the James Gang were our special guests now, and we took out baby bands like Styx, Journey, and Montrose. There was no consistency. One night in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, our opening act was a circus juggler. He rode a unicycle and people in the audience tried to knock him off by throwing coins at him. Now, I had seen strange bills in the late 1960s and early 1970s, things like Led Zeppelin and Woody Herman's orchestra. That sort of thing was considered hip, but putting some poor soul on stage on a unicycle before Kiss? It was tough enough for a regular band to open for us. In the summer of 1975, we still opened some shows too. We played as a support act for Black Sabbath and for Rare Earth. But in those cases, the venues were massive. The first show we played with Sabbath was at the Baltimore Civic Center for 10,000 people. And again, just as the year before, whether or not we opened, we did a full-on Kiss show. We had pyro and the big Kiss logo sign behind us. That night in Baltimore, nobody took down or covered our sign, so Sabbath played in front of a huge Kiss logo. The next night, we were scheduled to open for Sabbath again, this time in Providence, Rhode Island. Their people told us no pyro tonight. Fine, we said. We're going back to the hotel. We're not playing. You know where to reach us if you change your mind. It was our way or no way. We felt committed to doing a Kiss show, and we really were prepared not to do the show. A little while later, the phone rang at the hotel. Okay, come back to the venue. Do your show the way you want to. By this point, Bill Aucoin had hatched a plan, the plan. We were building a rabid following as a live act. We had climbed to at least occasional headlining status, especially in the Heartland, but this wasn't reflected in our tepid album sales. With 120,000 sales, Dressed to Kill had done better than Hotter Than Hell's 90,000 and Kiss's 60,000. But it was nothing when we considered the crowds we saw at our shows. Where was the disconnect? What was going on? The albums didn't sound like we sounded live. And so Bill presented his plan. A live album, a sonic souvenir of our show, which now attracted people in droves. As a model, he held up a live album by Uriah Heep that had helped that British band establish themselves. That album had worked in Britain, but the idea of a career-boosting live album by rock bands was not yet established in the United States. This was all before live albums made the careers of Peter Frampton, Cheap Trick, and Bob Seger, to name a few. Since the only thing missing as far as the band was concerned was an album that truly represented us, Bill's idea struck a chord. We hired Eddie Kramer to produce the live recordings. Bill arranged to hire photographer Finn Costello, who had worked on the Uriah Heep album, and we used the title Alive from a live record by Slade. Through the summer of 1975, we recorded shows, beginning with a sold-out Cobo Hall in Detroit, where Costello shot the audience, 12,000 people strong, for the back cover. We shot the front cover image in Detroit too, but we went across town to the Michigan Palace, the site of some of our best early shows and our rehearsal space for a few days in the run-up to the live recording at Cobo. People have argued whether Alive is a purely live recording or somehow enhanced. The answer is yes, we enhanced it. Not to hide anything, not to fool anyone, but who wanted to hear a mistake repeated endlessly? Who wanted to hear an out-of-tune guitar? For what? Authenticity? At a concert, you listen with your ears and eyes. A mistake that passes unnoticed in the moment lives forever when recorded. We wanted to recreate the experience of our show. Whatever needed to be done, we did it. The flashpots were enhanced with recordings of cannons, because that's what they sounded like in person. The audience was jacked up to immerse the listener in the crowd. It was the only way to replicate our concert on steroids. We figured the people who celebrated with us at a concert wanted to hear what they remembered, what they perceived. We also made sure the audience could be heard throughout the show, just as you would experience it live. Most live albums in those days sounded like studio recordings until the song ended, when some applause could be heard between songs. But we wanted to portray the real concert experience, and the back cover paid tribute to those fans who made all that noise and turned our shows into such powerful communal events. We couldn't have picked a better person to do Kiss Alive than Eddie Kramer. His brilliance in the studio and his innovations in enhancing the recordings were not only ground-shaking, but groundbreaking. He had different audience sounds on tape loops that were sometimes 20 feet long, held taut on mic stands and going around so you would never hear a repeat of any fan response. He had all these mic stands set up in the studio with different lengths of audience participation tape running on them, so we could bring an actual crowd reaction, whether it was a murmur or a roar. I certainly never would have thought of that, to create different loops of tape and have them going continuously so we could raise them and lower them and get different crowd reactions at will. It was brilliant. One bone of contention as we put the finishing touches on the album was a long, boring drum solo. Soloing was not Peter's forte. He often sounded more like Ricky Ricardo playing the bongos than a rock and roll drummer playing a legitimate solo. Plus, a solo that might be riveting at a show when combined with effects in an audience could be mind-numbingly dull in record form. So we edited it. "If you don't put it back in," Peter told us, "I'm quitting the band." Sigh. Same old crap. The result, basically the entire show we were doing at that point, captured the sonic magnitude of Kiss live. Finally, we had something that put the listener in the audience. We had made a quantum leap forward from the first 3 studio albums. The package came out great too, with the photo of the audience, the shot of the band with basically all our effects going off at once, and the notes from each band member to the fans. We wrote the notes to personify the Star Child, the Demon, the Catman, and the Spaceman. Certainly my character has always been flamboyant, and I wrote my note without making it gender-specific. It was written to the audience at large. When I wrote, "Dear lovers, nothing arouses me more than seeing you getting off on me," it could have been taken for heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual love. I wasn't threatened by any implications of the superficial aspects of sexuality or style. I considered it a compliment to be found attractive by anyone and everyone, sought after and emulated by people regardless of gender or sexual orientation. It never felt like a threat to my sense of masculinity or identity. If I were gay, it certainly wouldn't be something I would hide or be ashamed of, but I'm not. I was just comfortable enough with my sexuality not to attach anything negative to androgyny and vulnerability. At least not while in character. Vulnerability was not something I showed off stage. I was still too insecure. One night on the road after Alive came out, a woman and I were lying under the sheets in a hotel bed. She turned to me puzzled and said, "My boyfriend told me you were gay." "Well, I guess that didn't work," I said, "because it didn't keep you away."